What we're going to try to do today, as you know, is first the briefing with General Breedlove. And Scott Gray will moderate that session, introduce the general. We'll take a break. We come back, we're going to talk about the role of the financial system in war. Now, yesterday you saw at the end of a presentation a cartoon or a poster, buy war bonds. And we even had a joke or two about it. Just for background, the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. Benjamin Strong's first patriotic national role was to encourage people to buy war bonds. Now, in my new book, which will be finished by 2035 if I'm lucky, there's an excerpt in a chapter devoted to the New York Fed and the Federal Reserve during World War I, in which the Fed did not apply monetary policy. But the chairman of the Federal Reserve went out and said to people, support the country, buy war bonds. So there's a lot of history that over time we'll get into, and we will discuss this. So the second part of today is the role of the financial system in war. That's a very broad topic. And the third is a very special treat for our audiences worldwide. Kathleen Stephenson is the chair emeritus of the GIC, but she's currently the chair, the College of Central Bankers for the Global Interdependence Center, and that's a little-known club of former governors and presidents of central banks, and we have two. Zdeněk Tuma, who was governor of the Bank of the Czech Republic. I have a story or two having visited him in Prague, but I don't think I'll tell that right now. And Alfonso Prat-Gay, who was the governor of the central bank in Argentina at the time when the Argentine currency had stable value. It does happen in Argentina every once in a while. And he also became finance minister when Macri became elected. And because of the relationships with the GIC, we actually had a GIC delegation to Buenos Aires and met with him for almost 2 hours. And it was after he had negotiated and settled if I remember correctly, 120 billion US dollar claims against his country, which had kept Argentina out of financial markets for a number of years. And he was very gracious with his time, and he walked our delegation through the step-by-step year it took him to resolve and settle the largest US dollar denominated default in history. So he's a friend of the GIC. Both of them are fellows in the College of Central Bankers. So Kathleen, when we get to your session this morning, it'll be very exciting. For now, that's where we are. Are we okay, Kelly? We're in business. So Karen Holbrook cannot be with us this morning. So she welcomes. We thank the sponsors whose names are at the bottom of the slides you see, and I want to particularly thank Bill Kennedy and RiskBridge, who joins Cumberland Advisors in helping sponsor this, and all the rest you know. And let me introduce my partner in crime, colleague, and good friend, Scott Gray, for this session.
Well, thank you very much. And once again, to all the sponsors, thank you so much. I want to put a plug in for the Air Force Association here. Part of the mission of the Air Force Association is to educate communities and to educate Congress, all right? And it's through the AFA that we have been able to get speakers such as General Breedlove. On the 9th of March, we're going to have General Deptula, who's the head of the Air Force Mitchell Institute, which is a research arm. And then we're going to have on the 21st of April, General Hawk Carlisle. We do that with the money we raise through memberships of AFA. So I urge everybody out there that's listening today, if you're not a member of AFA, please go to afa.org and join in so we can continue to get this kind of great speakers to come out and help educate us on worldwide events. It's my honor today to introduce, not interview. You'll do the interviewing with your questions. But I'm going to introduce General Phil Breedlove, who I spent a year with at National War College, 94 to 95, and learned great respect for a man as a friend, as a student, as an officer. Very rarely does an officer of the United States Air Force get to command, okay? Well, General Breedlove has had 8 major commands, all right? He's had fighter squadrons, fighter groups, 3 fighter wings, numbered Air Force, a MAJCOM, and combatant command, and an alliance. He was the SACEUR, and that's the position that General Eisenhower held during World War II, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. He's an expert on NATO. He's an expert on European affairs. He's an expert on air power. And we're absolutely fortunate and delighted to have General Breedlove as our keynote speaker today. So, General Breedlove, thank you, sir, for your time, and thank you for agreeing to come here and give us an update. You kicked it off last year with a absolutely stunning overview of the conflict in NATO and what may or may not happen, and we're looking for an update. So over to you, sir.
Well, first of all, good morning, Scott, and thank you and the host for having me. And I look forward to our conversation. Are you hearing me well?
Yes, sir. We got you.
Okay, great. So I really am not going to talk very long. What I want to do is, as we sometimes say in the military, I'm going to roll some grenades out on the table. And when they go off, then we'll have a lively question and answer period. I do still work for our government. Both the Department of State and DOD occasionally call on me. I do represent the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech, but none of what I'll say today is really tied to any of those organizations. I'm going to give you my personal feelings. Some of you listened to me last year a little bit. The bottom line is I was the SACEUR during the first 2 invasions of Ukraine by Russia in 2014. And we made probably the largest changes to NATO, its readiness, and its structure as a result of those. The last 2.5 years of my time as SACEUR in reacting to Russia's invasion. So today, I am just going to hit about 4 or 5 big points, talk about them a little bit, and then I want to get to questions and answers and see what you really want to talk about. The first and most important thing to remind ourselves is that this conflict is completely contrived. There was no international security concern for Russia that would answer for this conflict. It is completely contrived by Mr. Putin to change the international security arrangements of Eastern Europe. And the best way that I could describe that is that he wanted to go back to a Warsaw Pact / Soviet Union style arrangement in this area. We can get a very good insight into what he thinks in a series of 3 documents that he put out before the war. The first several months before the war is known as the 5,000-word diatribe, where he launches into a conversation that there is no Ukraine. It is a part of Russia. And he always refers to Ukraine as the Ukraine, as we would refer to the Southeast or the Southwest. And he sees the Ukraine as a part of Russia. It's interesting to note, and there's some really cool memes out there. If you were to, the one I like the most is a series of photographs. They're maps and drawings because we didn't have photographs back then. But basically, it shows the beginning of the 2 cities of Moscow and Kyiv. And it puts them side by side in time. And when Kyiv starts to show up, it is over 200 years later that Moscow starts to show up. So Kyiv and the Ukraine actually existed in an organized way well before Moscow and the Muscovites in Moscow. But Mr. Putin continues to insist that there is no Ukraine and it is a part of Russia. The last two documents that some of you may have read are quite instructive. They were handed to the West. The target was truly Washington, D.C., but they were handed to the West 7-8 days before the war. And we were essentially told by Mr. Putin, sign them or there will be other means. The West and the United States chose not to sign either of those documents, and we now understand what those other means were or are. And you should Google these and read them. The boiled down version is pretty striking. Get all of NATO as much as we can out of our near abroad. Actually, I think the Russian words are touching nations. Get all of NATO's weapons, or as much as the weapons as we can get out of our near abroad / touching nations, and no, zero United States of America in our touching nations. Now, there's a lot of other stuff in there, and it's not quite said so clearly, but this is essentially how Mr. Putin wanted to rearrange the security architecture of Eastern Europe, whereby he could then use his military power and his money and his criminal influence to reestablish control of his touching nations. So what we see and can conclude from these documents brings us to my third point, which is this conflict is much, I'm going to say it 2 more times, much, much bigger than Ukraine. I and others at the beginning of this war said that there will be more. And I personally predicted that we would see the other touching states fall first. And what we're already seeing is in the southwest of Ukraine, Moldova, about a week ago, part of the government collapsed. The prime minister left because of pressure by Russia. So Russia is already starting on the next of its plan to reorganize Eastern Europe. So we grieve for and we look to help the people of Ukraine. But what we see is that it's bigger than Ukraine. And even when we help Ukraine through this, then it will be Moldova. After that, I think, is the rest of Georgia. And pretty soon, Mr. Putin will start bumping into NATO nations. Ukraine is just the first step. The third point, which I would like to make, is that the world, and I will pick it apart into 3 tranches, made a lot of very bad assumptions or misreads as we led into this war. The first one is that the U.S. and the West misread Russia. And I grade my paper F on this because as much as 6 months before the war, I was still saying Russia will not invade Ukraine. They have too much to lose. And frankly, they're not really ready for it. And I was wrong. And I'm here to tell you now that I was wrong. And so were so many others. It was about 3 months before the war started that we started seeing the kind of movement in military forces that then convinced us that they were, in fact, going in. But what happened is the West misread Russia, and we lost lots of time in helping prepare Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and other states that we expect are now firmly in Mr. Putin's sights as he does these rearrangements that he detailed for us in all of these documents. The second misread or bad judgment is Russia completely misjudged Ukraine. I think the most striking example is we now know, and the numbers are not perfect, it's either 8,000, 10,000 or something in between, but 8,000 to 10,000 of Russia's soldiers went across the border in the invasion of Ukraine without their personal fighting gear in their backpacks. In their backpacks were their dress uniforms because Russia expected to be holding parades in Kyiv as few as 4 days after this started. And Russia absolutely, completely misread Ukraine's will and determination to remain a sovereign, separate nation outside the domination of Russia. And then finally, I'll share a personal experience. It's not really secret much anymore, but I was a part of a delegation that was sent to Ukraine about 7 days before the war started to talk with President Zelensky and leaders of his military, both civilian and military, and we got to talk to multiple of the leading parties in the Rada and hear what the disparate political parties were saying about the upcoming war. And I must tell you that President Zelensky roundly chewed us out. And this is a man that many of us had met multiple times and considered a friend, but he was really not happy. And this leads to the third misread, and that is, in President Zelensky's own words, you in the West and your media and your news and so forth, all you're concerned about are the Russian battalion task groups on my border. And you seem to celebrate, oh, it's 12, oh, it's 24, it's 32 today, oh, we're up to 54. And we ended up at over 130, as you know. But his point was all eyes were fixed on Russia, and no one was watching what was going on in his country. And Russia's gray zone war, some call it Gerasimov's doctrine, NATO calls it the hybrid war, had been going on in Ukraine for about a year, disrupting power supplies, disrupting transportation, disrupting financial capabilities, threatening schools and threatening school buses. And President Zelensky said, you have been paying no attention to what's been going on already in my country. And then he said, and thankfully, neither you nor Russia have been watching our preparations. There may be a few soldiers among the audience. You will remember the term defense in depth. And while Ukraine had far less capable equipment and far fewer men than Russia, they had prepared an immaculate defense in depth north of Kyiv. And you see what happened. Russia sent its very best formations against that defense in depth, and they were defeated strategically in the north and northeast of Kyiv. So that was the third misstep that I believe the world made. And in each instance, each of these three missteps, if we had had a better read of what was going on, we could have better prepared during peace for the defense of Ukraine. And we did not take those opportunities because of our missteps in interpreting the situation. Then I would offer, and this is the part that gets me in trouble occasionally, frankly, but it is my held opinion as well as some of my closest colleagues. We in the West have had a series of missteps in the way we deal with Russia. When the wall came down, I was actually in Germany at the time, and I was literally on a Autobahn headed east towards the Czech border the day the wall came down there, and thousands of these little stinky, smoky cars were going the other direction on the Autobahn, and it was quite a sight. But that's not the story. The story is that once the wall came down, we in the West started what I call hugging the bear, trying to geostrategically bring Russia into a Western orientation and make a partner out of them. And many nations were desperate to start doing business with Russia and getting access to Russian energy. And so we were in about 2 decades of trying to hug the bear. Right in the middle of those 2 decades, 2008, Russia invaded Georgia. And the West, in my opinion, the West's response was inadequate to task. We fell short of the mark. To this day, Russia still occupies 20% of Georgia, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia. And they are today literally using their money and their corruption to change the government in Georgia as we sit. So in 2008, our response to that invasion, again, was inadequate to task. In 2014, Russia first invaded Crimea, which is a Ukrainian peninsula. They invaded it and occupied it. And then shortly thereafter, their forces invaded the Donbass and left behind the necessary military capability for the local partisans to claim control of 2 oblasts or counties or states in that area. And they still occupy those today. And so once again, the West's response was inadequate to task, and Russia was left holding about 12 to 13% of Ukraine's land, and some of the most important land, meaning the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea. So 2008, inadequate to task. 2014, inadequate to task. Now we find ourselves today in 2023, and we see that the world is once again trying to urge President Zelensky and his people to accept the loss of more of their land in order to get to a peace. If that is the case, I will be saying in another year that our response was inadequate to task. So we typically use one weapon when we deal with Russia on these issues, and that is sanctions. There are other weapons of our nation, and we are beginning now not to fight Russia, but we are arming Ukraine to fight Russia. So we're beginning to use a little bit of our military capability, but normally we use sanctions. And I just want to have one quick word on sanctions before we move on to my last point. Sanctions have hurt the Russian people. Sanctions have hurt the Russian economy, and sanctions have hurt Russia as a nation state on the world scene. But I'm going to be repetitive here because repetition is good for fighter pilots. Sanctions have never changed Mr. Putin's actions. Now, we are beginning to see some of the fabric around Mr. Putin fray because of the sanctions, and that will be a good thing. But to this date, in this war, sanctions have not changed any of Mr. Putin's actions. He is pressing ahead with his illegal war. And to remind, he and his army have weaponized rape, they have weaponized torture, they have weaponized murder, and they are to this day, and we believe it's over 14,800, removing children from Ukraine and taking them back to repopulate the diminishing Caucasian Slavic race in Russia. And so this was a horrible war, and the sanctions haven't changed it yet, but we do see some fraying around the edges. So I'm eating up too much of our time, and I want to close with this last point. Almost every time I speak, and I speak often on this subject, as you might imagine, I'm asked, how do you see the war ending? And I answer often like a politician answers. I say, it depends. But I am completely serious in that remark. I see 3 paths to an end of this war, and the choice of which path we will be on rests entirely in the governments of the Western nations supporting Ukraine. And I point firmly at ours first because we lead this policy in almost every respect. So there are three paths that I see. First of all, what we have seen and what the evidence shows is that when the Ukrainian army has the equipment it needs and it meets the Russian army on the battlefield, it defeats it every time. Ukraine is operationally and tactically superior to Russia. Ukraine is not strategically superior to Russia because Russia has way more manpower and way more equipment yet to be brought to the battlefield. And Ukraine's manpower is ultimately limited, and it literally has almost no capability of bringing additional equipment to the battlefield. It is wholly dependent on the West. So if the West chooses to have a policy, which they have not chosen yet, that they're going to supply Ukraine to win, and they give Ukraine what it needs to win, Ukraine will defeat Russia in detail and remove them from Ukrainian land. Now, there'll be lots of questions about then what? And Mr. Putin keeps threatening us because his very best tool is not his army. His very best tool is his intimidation and deterrence. Our country and many in the West are nearly completely deterred by doing what they need to do because we are fearful of Mr. Putin and what he might do. So, item one, we give them what they need, they win. We give them what they need to win, they will win. We use words today like we give them everything they need, but we don't describe the object of what they need. And right now, we're just keeping them on the battlefield, not allowing them to be defeated, as opposed to supplying them such that they could win. Item two, if we keep doing that, if we keep doing what we're doing now, which is to keep Ukraine on the battlefield until they go to the negotiating table, then in the end, Ukraine will lose. Again, Mr. Putin has far more manpower and far more equipment to bring to the battlefield, and the manpower of Ukraine will begin to dwindle at some point, and they will have to capitulate and give up more land, and Mr. Putin will secure the larger part of Ukraine in this round, and in the next attack, the next war, as he's refit and refurbed, he'll take the rest of it. The third option is really easy. If the West stops supplying Ukraine now, they will lose. Russia will overrun them and will once again be in charge of the sovereign nation of Ukraine, which will no longer be sovereign. So I think I've said enough. There's so much more to talk about. Rather, what I'd like to do now is open it up to you and see what you would like to talk about. So, Scott, over to you to line up the questions.
Okay, well, I appreciate it, sir. And once again, thanks for that great overview there. The first question I'll ask while we wait for things to get out, you said if we supply what it takes to win, what is it takes to win? Air power? We talked last year about F-16. Should we supply F-16s to them? What will it take to win, in your opinion?
So it will take a consistent and reliable supply chain. Right now, we literally have had Ukraine run down to less than 2 days of artillery shells before we get artillery shells in there for them to use. That's no way to plan a fight. You have to change the way your soldiers act on the battlefield when you don't know whether in 2 days you're going to be out of artillery or not. So the first item is that we are consistent in supplying the normal day-to-day consumption rates of the things that they're using to fight this war. Secondarily, right now we have given Russia sanctuary. Everything outside of Ukraine is Russia's sanctuary. They fire into Ukraine in the northeast from Belarusia, all the way around through Russia, all the way around through the Black Sea, nearly 300 degrees on the globe. Russia is firing into Ukraine. And we have forbid Ukraine from returning fire with any of the weapons that we give them. They have developed some indigenous weapons and they've done some shooting into Russia, but is very minute. We put a policy limitation on them, which they have observed faithfully to not shoot into Russia. We are so deterred by what Russia might do. We have literally told Ukraine, you will fight this war on your territory, not Russia's territory. You will not return fire. And so we actually have digitally limited some of the radars and weapons that we have given them in the past so that they can't shoot into Russia. That is sanctuary. America has never won a war where there was sanctuary for the enemy. So we need to think about what we're forcing on Ukraine. So we need policy that says we're going to support Ukraine to win. And we need policy that says you can responsibly return fire. Ukraine has been very disciplined in their use of American weapons, and I believe they can be absolutely counted on to remain disciplined in the future because they rely on us giving it to them. So we need policy. We need to say we're going to win, and then we need to give them the tools like long-range air power, ATACMS missiles that can reach into Crimea and to hit troop concentrations in Russia, and all the things of that ilk.
So last year, and this is a follow-up to that actually, last year you discussed offensive and defensive weapons, and so did General Deptula. It sounds like you're saying that we need to give them the policy and the ability to go on the offensive. Is that fact or fiction?
Well, here's what I know. The Ukrainians, Zelensky, his leadership, the members of the Rada that we have personally talked to, I have personally talked to, not a single one of them wants an inch of Russian soil. So they don't want to be on the offensive, quote unquote, offensive. What they want to be able to do is apply weapons to Russian forces that are attacking them. I would say strategically that is the defensive. If you see a massive army formation sitting 20 miles in Russia queuing up to attack, they should be able to start destroying that enemy before he comes into their country. That is not offensive action. That is a strategic strike in defense of your homeland.
All right, very good. We've got a question that's very interesting one, actually. One of the common arguments Russia uses to justify their occupation in Donbass is that the majority of the people living in Donbass are aligned with and want to be part of Russia. What can you say about that perspective?
Well, the polling there does show that some of those people align themselves with Russia, but the polling also shows that there are much of those people that do not align themselves with Russia, and that is growing because of the brutal nature of the Russian occupation and the people they left there to administrate those areas. It's just like people say the same thing about Crimea. They conveniently forget about the Crimean Tatars and others who do not want to be a part of Russia. And so here's the bottom line. How much of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California are you willing to cede back to Mexico because there are people there that speak those languages and align themselves with Mexico? The fact of the matter is Ukraine is a sovereign nation. There are sovereign boundaries that the world recognizes, and Russia is not, should not, and we should not allow them to just muster their army and go conquering their neighbor nations.
Okay. We have a question over here. And please identify yourself for General Breedlove.
Yes, thank you. Kathleen Stephenson from the GIC. Thank you so much for your remarks. I want to shift a little bit to the membership of NATO. And we have Finland and Sweden having essentially wanting to join NATO, but lately Sweden is falling behind due to the challenge that Turkey is putting on. Can you comment on whether this is strategically a real problem or whether it's just a bump in the road? Thank you.
Well, I join others, and I think that the Secretary General even said a day before yesterday at the ministerials there that he fully expects this is going to happen, and it's going to happen sooner rather than later. There are some indications that Mr. Erdogan, who is really the driving force behind the objection to Sweden, is beginning to make arrangements, and Sweden is making some concessions to try to move forward in the talks with Turkey. And so I do believe that this will, I also join the group that believe this will happen sooner rather than later. I must tell you that Sweden and Finland both, for over a decade, now almost 2 decades, have been very closely aligned with NATO. They exercise at extremely high levels and highly technical levels with NATO. Their militaries are interdependent, interoperable with our NATO allies better than some of our new NATO allies. So these are two nations who have like-minded understandings of the rights of people and democracy. They are like-minded in their military approach. They have kit that is interoperable with NATO kit. And so they have been highly aligned with us for some time. And almost every SACEUR felt exactly like me. It would be extremely good if they chose to come into NATO. We don't go clawing after them, pulling them in, or these words that's always used, expanding. But if they wanted to come aboard, we would be really happy. And to just get really to the point of your question, yes, it's very strategically important. These are two nations that occupy key territory, and they have extremely capable militaries, not huge militaries, but extremely capable militaries who have fought Russia before, and they will make a strong contribution to the alliance in both principle and military power.
Okay, question over here.
General, thank you for your comments. It's David Burson, Cumberland Advisors. I have 2 questions. Number 1, actions beget reactions. If the Western powers give Ukraine the weapons they need to succeed, what will the Russian reaction be? And give us some scenarios there. And 2, the Russian army was supposedly one of the most modern, best in the world, and yet even without the best defensive weapon systems, they have been held in check by the Ukrainians. Why is that, and what lessons does that give us for our own military?
Let me answer the last one first, and I'm so old you may have to remind me of the first one, but I think I'll get to it. So it is apparent now that Russia has had a cancer in their military for a long time. Remember that most of the leaders in Russia, people call them oligarchs. I don't call them oligarchs. I call them kleptocrats, because most of them, their number one thing in life is, how do I extract money from Russia and the Russian people? And what we have found is this extends into the military. For instance, there was a train bringing tanks from a supply depot in Russia that arrived up north of Kyiv in the very start of this war. I don't know for sure. It has been reported that when the train pulled in, the train commander, who had been the commander of the depot, committed suicide, because every tank in that train, all the laser rangefinder gear, all of the radios, all the transponder gear, all the high value, easily pilferable equipment that could be taken to sell to raise money was missing from every tank. The tanks were nearly worthless. And what we see is there is a cancer there. Several of their very best missile systems that were sold at a great price to Russia, supposedly having all this capability to knock down, for instance, our HIMARS and other things, are grossly, let me say it one more time, grossly underperforming on the battlefield. So somebody has sold Russia some missiles at a really high price that don't do what they were bought to do. And so what I do believe is we were not as attuned to this possibility as possibly we could be. And there has been a cancer inside that military that has really impacted it. And frankly, it extends also into the training of their people. Their exercises are scripted and somewhat drama filled. It's not exercise to fail as many of our Western nations do, where you learn from your failures. So I think that there are some systemic problems that we're beginning to see about how Russia builds its military. Lots of flash when it comes to the new weapons they're creating. You know, the Satan missile, the Super Satan missile, the double top probation, top secret Satan missile. You know, and we kept getting these sort of campaigns to deter and dissuade us. Okay, so remind me the first question.
All right, the first part of the question, I'm going to paraphrase it, was if the West gives Ukraine what they need to win, what's the Russian reaction?
Right. So if you listen to Mr. Putin, and I said this earlier in my talk, Mr. Putin's army is failing him. But Mr. Putin's war of words, his war of intimidation and deterrence, it is succeeding magnificently. So I say that so that I can set the stage that if you believe what Mr. Putin says and his people say, almost daily, some spokesman, Lavrov or someone else from Russia, is reminding the West that if Russia loses its nukes, we're going to nuclear war. The other thing that the West fears is that their sons and daughters will have to go to war. And it's not as often as the nuclear threat, but every week or so, you'll hear a speech or one of the big spokespersons remind that, you know, the way this is going as this war draws on, the sons and daughters of America are going to fight and die on the battlefield. And so the first thing that we have to realize is Mr. Putin wants us to fear nukes, and he wants us to fear a long, protracted war with Russia. So that's what he puts out there. Now, I must tell you, you know, I'm not a scholar, but I do now teach in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. And I have learned that we really need to, in all cases, examine both sides of the problem. And if we do this in an academically honest way, we cannot discount the fact that Mr. Putin might do what he actually says he would do and use nuclear weapons. I believed that more 5 or 6 months ago. Now that I see the kleptocrats around Mr. Putin, both military kleptocrats and more traditional kleptocrats around Putin beginning to fray in their support for him, I am less sure that they would follow those orders. Think about you if you were a kleptocrat looking at the future of Russia, and if you see this individual leader who's going to turn Russia into a wasteland by starting that kind of war, you're not going to be able to extract money from Russia after he does that. And I believe there are kleptocrats in that next layer right below him, the ones that are dependent on him. They are actually starting to fray with, I don't see a future for me being able to extract money from Russia after this all settles down. So I really talked out of both sides of my mouth. I apologize for that. I think that we have to know that Mr. Putin is dissuading, threatening, and deterring with every word out of his mouth. And we need to calculate or fold that into our calculus. But we cannot, in academic honesty, discount the fact that he might do what he says. I'm sure that does not answer your question, but that's pretty much the way I answer it every time I'm asked.
Well, that's a fair answer, to say the least. So I have a question here about, and it's a two-part question. Number one, what are NATO's tripwires right now? And I'm not talking about necessarily tripping Article 5, but are there other tripwires such as nuclear or chemicals or that kind of stuff? And then the second part to that goes, what's your thinking on the relationship now between Iran supplying weapons to Russia and the Chinese-Russian relationship. So, two-part question again.
Okay, you may have to remind me again, but
All right.
so let's talk about China and Iran. Iran is pretty straightforward. Iran wants to make money, and Iran wants to form a more strategic alliance with Russia against their mutual enemy, the United States. And so I think that Iran is going to do everything it can to have its military industrial complex profit from its arrangements with Russia, and hopefully buy influence and protection along the way. China is different, I think. I think China's really happy to see Russia's military being diminished, because remember, they share a long border with Russia. And they're probably happy to see that Russia's military power is getting trashed pretty good in this war. But I also believe China is a little bit worried about some of the performance of the weapons that they have bought from Russia. Some of those very same missile systems we were talking about now populate China, and China has used them as the example from which to clone their own types of weapons. And they see some of these weapon systems failing in Ukraine, tank design, missile design, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that it brings a little consternation. And frankly, I do not think China appreciates nor wants Russia talking about using nuclear weapons, because Russia has a whole lot of weapons, small weapons, that can reach deep into China from their shared border. And I don't think China wants that to start. Scott, remind me of the other one real quick.
Oh, the other one, are there any tripwires besides Article 5 that may get NATO involved? And an add-on to that is, are there any NATO nations that are secretly or even supposedly hoping that a tripwire is tripped or Article 5 is invoked?
Okay, so to the latter, I don't think anybody really wants to go to war. Now, I can tell you that the touching nations, the Baltics, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, these nations who have been subjugated and brutalized by Russia in the past, and their wealth exported away, etc., none of them want to see a successful Russia. But I think it's a little far-fetched to think that they actually want to go to war with Russia. Now, I think they would very much support right now giving Ukraine everything it needs to defeat Russia in detail. I think that is good. And I get so wrapped up in the answers, I forget the other questions.
Yeah, the other one, are there any other tripwires out there that may get NATO sucked in?
So if you remember, there was about 5 months ago, after the strategic defeat of Russia in the north, northwest, and northeast of Kharkiv, there was a great concern. I mean, Russia amped up the rhetoric in such a high way about nukes, nukes, nukes. Everybody was talking nukes, 2 or 3 speakers a day talking about nukes. And so the West had a series of conversations which are classified, and we can't talk all about the specifics. But what we do know is that the West thought about a framework of reply. Things that I believe guided that framework of reply is that we would try to avoid in every case of returning nukes for nukes, because we don't want that war. Sam Nunn says you cannot fight and win a nuclear war. I agree with him. And we don't want to go down that path. So the West looked at some pretty devastating conventional replies to what would happen if Russia popped off a nuke. Now, there is a red line there. We talk about nukes, and you know this, in 2 ways. There's counter value and counter power or capability nukes. And so if you're using a nuke against an armed formation in the field, we see that differently than using a nuke against a city, counter value. And many have said if Russia did an incredibly ugly counter value strike and killed a lot of civilians, then the West might actually reply in the same way. But in general, we were not going to go down a nuclear path. Rather, we would put forward what many would call a pretty devastating conventional knockdown, sinking the entire Black Sea Fleet, dropping the Kerch Bridge, attacking a large formation in the field or something like that, and really showing them what Western air and sea power could do.
Okay, question over here.
Yes, General, this is Bob Eisenbeis. Thank you very much for your remarks. You've described pretty significantly the defeats militarily that the Russians have experienced as they try, particularly in north of Kyiv. Their other objective was to weaken NATO, which obviously hasn't happened for sure. Do those two reputational defeats, in a sense, change the equation at all in terms of the willingness and the probabilities that the West will respond to enable Ukraine to win?
Wow, that I thought was going to be a really easy question until the very last piece. So let me just jump on that, and if I'm not answering your question, get Scott to wave his hand at me, and I'll stop. But what will change the West's opinion of how they support Ukraine is an incredibly tough question. And a year ago, it was pretty easy. We would talk about the old NATO and the new NATO. The old NATO, less concerned about some of the things where Russia was doing. The new NATO, which were most of them all former Russian vassal states who had been brutalized and earned their, some of them had to earn their independence twice from Russia. They had a very different feeling. And so it was really interesting to see how the Secretary General and others were navigating the two pools to try to bring them together. But Mr. Putin solved a lot of those problems. Once again, remember, every time we take over a territory from Russia, we find evidence of rape, torture, murder. And right now we're watching them deport children back into Russia. And these gross atrocities in this war, and the way Mr. Putin is conducting the war now, which is I can't operationally do what Scott and I learned to call combined arms warfare. Since I'm unable to do that, rather now what I do is I level a town and sort out what's living with my artillery. And so those approaches to this war have brought old NATO and new NATO much closer together. I'm not a political analyst, but I lived 8 times in Europe, but 5 times in Germany. And I knew the political landscape there pretty well. And in the 80s and 70s, 80s, 90s, the Green Party had a distinct orientation. It is very different than the Green Party of today, which has taken a step towards understanding international security needs and reorienting the Bundeswehr so that it can be a more effective army as it was in the 70s and 80s. So I guess the point I would say is that Russia's atrocities have brought NATO closer together. But we're at a very big step. There are still people that are investing in their military. They have a firm stance on Russia and supporting Ukraine. But the step which says we're going to support Ukraine to win is a big step for all of them. And I do not think that all of old NATO has gone over that step yet. I would say that much of new NATO is over that step. So I hope I answered there.
Okay, very good. Question back here.
General, you described pretty well Russia, and I think they've been a rotten society for much more than 100 years. I mean, if you look back at history, and you know the casualties and the lack of success in World War I really brought on a revolution, which was fundamental. And I remember being in Russia in the 80s when they were in Afghanistan. We did a little business there, and I remember talking to a couple guys who had children or relatives in Afghanistan, and there was a lot of discontent with the casualties that were happening there and the stakes and everything about that. So my question really is, and right now, Putin has the support of the kleptocrats while it may be fraying, and that's what's holding up society. It's really a criminal society. It's not for the benefit of the Russian people. There's a good deal of, I would call it perverted patriotism here, of support that's probably real in Russia. But at what point do the Russians say enough is enough, and there is a real problem in Russia maintaining the existing regime? That's a hard question, but I wonder what your thoughts are.
Well, so the first thing I would say is that I'm not taking umbrage with what you said, but I do believe there's that layer of kleptocrats, and then there's a layer of functionaries who make their money based on being in the government. But I actually believe a lot of the Russian people are a lot like us. They want their kids to go to school. They want good jobs. They want to have food on their table, and they want their vodka. And it's not a big deal. But you also ably capture a point which is important, and that is Russia completely controls what they see. The intelligentsia and some of the better educated have got their tentacles into outside sources where they can get different news. But the average Russian, as you have heard many times, doesn't read a lot of papers or periodicals or, whatever. They watch TV. And Mr. Putin controls the television media completely. And so if you believe the polling, the support remains pretty high. And the people sort of see this as, yes, we're fighting Nazis and we're fighting America, who is the puppet, pulling all the puppet strings and so forth. And so Mr. Putin is pretty good at that. I mean, you know his roots in the KGB, etc. But I do believe the good news is this is beginning to fray. And when you start seeing TV stations have a different kind of approach in what they say, and when you start to see that the militaries like Mr. Prigozhin and the Chechen general Halakai, these guys have substance and armies, and they're starting to have conversations that are disparate from where we would think Mr. Putin would like them to go. And so even though he has this immense control, I do believe now we're starting to see the fraying of support. I hope I answered your question.
Okay.
General, it's David Kotok. You were kind enough to help us kick off this series 1 year ago, as we're in the second year of this series. And we've tried to design this series to blend military defense, regional shooting war, and worldwide financial sanctions and payments war. So after this session, there will be a session on finance during wartime and another one on central bank roles. And yesterday we had Bill Hoagland and Byron Callan go through some of the defense budget. And here we are in the United States, distant from the shooting war, embroiled in a political fight over a debt ceiling, which is about as dumb a political fight as you can imagine we should pay for and finance what we've already spent and authorized. How do you see, and how does your institution see, bridging finance and economics with military and defense so we can raise the level of understanding rather than separate the two disciplines? Because the military folks are very skilled, and we hear them. And the finance economic folks are in a different place, and they don't blend. And the younger finance economic folks didn't wear uniforms. I have a uniform, doesn't fit me anymore. So how do we bridge that? How do we connect to sensitize what looks like an American population which is very distant from what is a very serious threat?
So my insight into those is thin because economics is not my forte. But if you will allow me, what I'd like to do is talk about two things that are extremely important to me, and they relate to what you're talking about, and they're things that we're going to have to address and change. Scott will tell you he's looked at the way the military does budgets, and every year we get a budget, and every year we build what's a new FYDP, 5-year defense plan, and et cetera, and commitments and contracts that we write are having to be developed in a way that we know we're going to get a different budget every 2 years. And we don't know if the budget from the previous year is going to agree with the budget of this year is going to agree with the previous year. Any long-term build like a C-17 or an F-35 or whatever, you're literally renegotiating the whole contract every year because of adjustments. If you build an estimated cost based on X, and then this year it's X minus, or this year it's X plus, or whatever, and that accordion keeps moving around, it's essentially almost a renegotiation of the contract and price every time that there's a change in that budget. And so what this does is introduce a lot of higher pricing because people can't take risks. If you tell a person that I want you to build 2,000 sets of these things so we can build 2,000 airplanes, and then the very next year somebody says, well, we really only want to do 1,200. And then the next year's, well, maybe we're going to do 2,100. What happened is the companies will try to recapitalize and recoup their money in the first year or two because that's the only 2 years that they have any confidence in, which raises the prices of all the things that go into an airplane because everybody's saying, well, we have no idea what the government's really going to do. They want us to give them a price on 2,000, but then if they build only 1,200, we lose money, our investors lose money, et cetera, et cetera. And so it drives what I would call irresponsible acquisition practices because of the uncertainty of long-term commitments. And so the first thing that I think we're going to have a conversation about in the not this budget and not next year's budget, because they're pretty much already done. I mean, the next 2 years, about 3 years out, there appears in Congress now to be a willingness to discuss multi-year contracts, which would settle those perturbations down. But realize, and this is not being accusatory, I completely understand it. What that does is reduces Congress's ability to control the military, because the way they control the military now is if they're not happy with the military, they say, okay, well, we're not going to build 400 ships. We're only going to build this many or whatever. And then when they negotiate what their problems were about, we settle down on something else. And that's not nefarious. That is their oversight. So we've got to come to some agreement that gives us multi-year contracting to allow more responsible acquisition practices, yet satisfies Congress's need for oversight. The second thing I see here, looking at your watch, Scott, I'll be short on this one.
You're good. Keep going, sir.
The second thing that I think you all should be very concerned about, and I know my daughter lives in Tampa and works for USF, and she runs a team that does all of the scientific work for U.S. Special Operations Command, and she talks to me about this all the time. and you see it in the papers every day. We have a defense industrial base problem. We have trained all of the builders of everything for the military to minimize, de minimis. You are going to pay you for 200. Do not spend a penny on 201. Irresponsible. We'll hold you to task for it. And now all of a sudden we're saying, why don't you have this excess capacity that we need to support Ukraine? And so our approach to the defense industry is de minimis. Squeeze everything down. And I'm telling you that the defense industrial base, I consult to several of them, they are there. They are not going to build excess capacity and take a risk, and then the government doesn't use it, and they have to explain to their shareholders why they built all this capacity that they never used and why they lost them money. So one of the things I think we have to do is we're learning today, every day, that we don't have enough of what we need. And when we have a crisis like this in the world, we are really don't have what we need. And we need to figure out how to incentivize the defense industrial base such that they might be able to have excess capacity that we could call on quickly. An example, and I'm not going to put the weapon out there because that's just not right, because you would identify the company and all that. But one of the weapons that we're using a lot of in Ukraine, the DOD went to them several months ago and said, we need you to get to this level of production above where you are now. And in a very serious way, the industrial partner did its homework and said, outstanding. We'll start first deliveries in 2027. Because the supply base, the smaller organizations that build small parts, they don't have money like some of the primes do to rapidly spin up. You know, if you've got, and I don't say this in a pejorative way, but if you've got a mom and pop organization that's building a laser gyro ring, and they're the only ones that build laser gyro rings, and you tell them, hey, you're giving me 20 a month, I need 400 next month. They're just going to laugh at you. And they're going to say, I got to train people, hire people, buy more materials, all that stuff. They're going to say, okay, 2027, 2028. And we've got to figure that out, because right now we are in a bad place on getting accelerated delivery of some of the things that our military will need that we are supplying to Ukraine. I hope that makes sense.
There's no doubt that it does, sir. And you've hit the acquisition morass perfectly, in my opinion, after living it for 2 years and trying to get stuff through Congress and through the defense partners that we have out there. It's a walking minefield, to say the least, and there is no short-term solution. Sir, changing spectrums just a bit, if you take a broader view of the conflict, how does the world's energy requirements and Russia's role as a supplier to these requirements influence a political solution between the Ukraine and Russia, the West and Russia, and OPEC and its customers?
Energy is going to be a huge issue for some time, because, as you know, it takes a long time to diversify supply and method of supply. And as we saw just a month or two ago, it takes overnight to disrupt things that take a decade to build and permanently disable them. And so this is going to be a problem. I think that Russia has done a very good job of teaching the world how they can weaponize energy supply. They did this in 2014, one of the coldest winters in European recent history. They literally cut off supplies of gas in Ukraine, especially in the surrounding Donbass areas and things. And elderly people died. I mean, they literally were weaponizing energy. And so I think what the world is seeing is they have to have some diversity in supply, and they may have to accept prices and styles of delivery that are non-traditional to work between now and a place where they have enough diversity that they're not going to be threatened by a nation that will weaponize supply. I'm a civil engineer by training at Georgia Tech, and I support trying to find better sources of energy. I happen to be a firm supporter of nuclear energy. I know that's not popular in some places, but there are lots of things that this world can do to have a more firm base on energy supply. And I think that that's the biggest lesson we're all going to learn is if we don't want to be blackmailed by it, we need to prepare ourselves now for what the next person who controls energy might do.
Okay, thank you. Question over here.
General, I want to sincerely thank you. You've addressed a lot of the questions that drew me to come to this conference. My name is Richard Miller. And your most recent comments about the kleptocrats around Putin and the perhaps his declining support was the original question I was going to ask when I raised my hand earlier. And you've sort of addressed that. But there's one more question, and this is maybe small ball compared to some of the things you've been talking about so informatively today. We've seen a lot of headlines recently about the Wagner Group in Ukraine, mercenaries apparently. It's never been clear to me what that means and portends, what this private army is in respect to Russia's larger efforts. Can you address that?
Yeah, and if you'll, I apologize, but I'll pronounce it the way the Russians do with a V, so it's the Wagner Group to them. May I just say that the Wagner Group is another example of kleptocracy. Russia can't afford or couldn't present as the kind of forces that they really needed. A man that was very, very personally close to Mr. Putin saw a way to make money, and he raised this large formation of people, and the small formation that he started with, these were highly trained people. A lot of them were former Spetsnaz, Russian special forces, and they were people who had come out of the military. And the first several groups of them that were employed were much more capable. They have been in action for some years in Africa. You may remember the most sort of notable interaction with the United States was a small battalion of the Wagner Group were about to attack a U.S. Formation in northern Syria, a small an outpost. And to his great credit, after they kept threatening and were moving into a position where they could begin to strike our base, President Obama gave approval, and United States air power, meaning air, Navy, Marine, Army power, were brought to bear on that Wagner Group, and they eliminated them to the man. Some say it was 310 casualties, not casualties, but deceased. I don't know that number's exactly right, but it's close. So the Wagner Group has been around for a while, and we in the United States, because we recognize them as a mercenary group and not Russian military, we eliminated them on the battlefield in northern Syria. And so it has had this interesting connotation, and the world sort of almost believes that they're not really Russian. Don't. These are Russians, led by Russians, doing Russian work. And until recently, they were almost completely obedient to the Russian general staff. We have seen them, and the gentleman I mentioned earlier, the Chechen named Kadyrov, and I am murdering the pronunciation of his name. But he's got a large group of Chechen mercenaries, probably 6 times the size of Wagner Group, that are also now helping Russia in this war. So this ability to raise these forces helps Mr. Putin's problem, because he has to mobilize to raise forces. And you saw how popular that was, meaning it was not popular. And you also see that even Wagner Group has had trouble raising forces because they started using prisoners. And some of the worst atrocities in this war have been committed by the Wagner Group people in Bucha, in Mariupol, and other places in Ukraine.
So, sir, a question here. You've used the word atrocity and weaponization of rape and deportation of children. History has proven that the victor writes the history. When will we start hearing the word war crimes, and how is that going to apply to what Putin is doing?
Oh, well, I hope you're already hearing them. We're banging this drum in an immense way in Washington, D.C. And if I could make a plea to your audience, you may not agree with everything I said. You may not agree with support to win in Ukraine, but I hope you'll agree that it is, and it is written in the Geneva rules, not the Geneva Convention, but about war crimes, that deporting and reconditioning children is a war crime, period, dot. So while you can talk about whether those murders were actually military actions when they shot all the men in the back of the head and pushed them into a ditch, or you can talk about the letters from home telling their soldiers it's okay to rape Ukrainian women, this is a part of the war. You can argue about all those things, but what you can't argue about right now is what they're doing with children. It is in the articles of this war crimes set of documents. And so I believe that we need to start banging that drum now. And I have already written my congressman about it. I actually called him. He's not returning my calls right now, but I think we need to be pushing this from every table in America, that we're not going to put up with this, and make our lawmakers understand that we're not going to put up with this, and they need to do something about it. And this is happening in multiple places around America. I'm a part of a group that meets and works all the time on these issues, and this is one of our pushes. You're starting to hear it discussed in Congress.
Okay, superb. Sir, next to last question here, all right? Last year you introduced to the audience the concept that we learned at National War College, DIME. Could you please talk about DIME and how it has or hasn't worked in relationship to the Ukrainian war?
So I like DIME because I'm a fighter pilot, and it's simple. And, fighter pilots are knuckle dragging Cro-Magnons, and they need simplicity and repetition. And we used to carry dimes in our pocket. We don't anymore, but we used to carry a dime coin in our pocket. DIME is diplomatic power, informational intelligence power, military power, and economic power. When Russia, when Daesh, when China attacks, they use all the weapons. America and the West tend to get stovepiped. When we fight radical Islam, we use M. We bomb them. When we fight Russia, we use E. We sanction them. And I think you and I would agree, we need to argue for a more balanced reply in these kinds of battles. I saved you 2 minutes for the last question.
All right, the last question. We've done this twice. Will we be here next year for a third session?
Yes. Even if we give Ukraine what they need, it will take time. The smarter people than me, and you should read some of Ben Hodges' work, believe, and I believe, that Ukraine can retake Crimea, but that's not going to be a small task. The real question is, next year, are we going to be talking about a Ukraine that is retaking its territory, or are we going to be talking about managing a world where Russia has overcome Ukraine and is now overcoming Moldova and starting to move troops into Georgia again, et cetera, et cetera. And that would be something else that I can't tell you what your opinion should be, but you should let your congressman know where you stand on that discussion. And I'll close this by saying, Scott, you know this, but I used to say 5 out of 5 of my children, which are 3 by blood and 2 by marriage, 5 out of 5 of my children were in the military or work for the military. My son is no longer working for the Navy, works for NASA. But the bottom line, I have 4 kids that are informed or tied so closely to the military that I don't want to have to go to war in Europe in the future. I'd rather take care of this problem right now.
Yeah. Sir, on behalf of the University of South Florida, the Global Independence Council, and the West Coast chapter of AFA and AFA in general, I want to thank you so much for your time, your opinions, your insight, and just your leadership that you've been showing throughout the world. Very, very amazing you've given us this time, and I just want to thank you personally, and I hope we're not here next year, but I fear we will be. Thank you very much. Okay, folks, we're going to take a short break, and we'll be back with David Kotok to take us to the next session. Thank you.
We're going to go to the second session. And you all know the title. We talked about it. Let me just, before this panel starts, a quick note in history. This is a session that's going to talk about finance and war. And what they're going to say, I don't know, because all 3 speakers are close friends, GIC members, and believe it or not, fishing buddies. So, and it's true. Now, I won't say a word about their fishing skills, except one of them still thinks that the way to catch the fish is to hit it over the head with the rod. However, you can figure out who that is. A word about finance and war. If you study the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides documented the worst political decision in history, or at least in antiquity, when it comes to finance and war. Demosthenes' major campaign leading Athens against Sparta was in Sicily. And in those days, retention of mercenaries was common practice, as we just heard from General Breedlove and the Wagner Group. It still is. The mercenaries that Athens hired were from Thrace. And because of the winds, they sailed to Athens, but they didn't get there in time to sail with Demosthenes to Sicily. So he sailed, he arranged with the leadership in Athens, and they were going to follow. He goes and is engaged in a massive military campaign, thinking the reserves are arriving because they are sailing. The Thracians arrive in Athens. The political body in Athens says, he's going to win in Sicily. If we pay combat pay to the mercenaries, it's 2 drachma a day. But if we don't pay them combat pay, it's 1 drachma a day. And Thucydides documents this very well in the Peloponnesian War. I realize everybody here likes to stay up at night and read that book, but so what did the political body do? They decided Demosthenes would win. They don't need to spend the money, and they say to Thrace, thank you for coming. We don't need you anymore, so you don't have to sail to Sicily, and we're not going to pay you 2 drachma a day. First of all, after they left, they turned into an enemy of the Greek city-states because they felt that there was a breach of contract, and they were pretty rough on a number of people. Secondly, Demosthenes is fighting a battle, the reserves never show up, and he loses. It was a turning point in the war with Sparta. Finance, a political decision, altered the Peloponnesian War, or at least arguably did. This panel, very distinguished, and I'll let Marianne Waldman introduce the panel. We'll talk about finance and war. Marianne.
Thank you, David. I was actually counting on you to do the introductions, but now that I have this pleasure of introducing my friends, Danielle DiMartino Booth and Dave Burson. Danielle is an analyst, former Federal Reserve, worked in the Federal Reserve, and is very much a expert on that, speaks frequently on lots of media. Many of you probably have seen her before. Dave Burson is an economist, currently chief economist at Cumberland Advisors. We have just changed our format slightly. Danielle has a presentation that she's going to do with slides, so I'm going to let her start, and we will be taking questions later and along the way. Thanks.
First of all, thank you all for having me here today, and thank you for arranging gorgeous weather. I'm delighted to be here. I didn't know as much about the subject matter going in as I would have otherwise. On day one at the Fed, they teach you two things. Monetary policy acts with a long lag, and you never ever talk about the dollar. So those are the big no-nos. So to try and think about how the dollar has or has not been affected in the last, it's almost February 24th, that Putin marched. So it's been almost a one-year anniversary here where we are. So in order to dive into this material, I kind of did a gut check. And when you think about demographics in the world, and the country that's kind of slipping demographically right now, and the country that is not, which is India. So when you contrast China and India and their shared need for resources, specifically energy, that took me back to the very beginning in the United Nations vote and seeing India abstain from condemning Putin's march on Ukraine. And that always kind of got my spidey senses going, that this massive country that is theoretically a true staunch ally of the United States abstained from voting. And then India did not recognize the sanctions as well. Not quite back to the Peloponnesian Wars, but in studying the history of Russia and India, I was kind of I learned a lot. I learned that Stalin initially called Nehru the running dog of world imperialism. And this is in 1947 when India achieved independence. And something changed that attitude on Stalin's part, and that was the Korean War, which is what makes me think of you. So India chose to be kind of Swiss-like. They chose to be neutral during the Korean War, and that was a major turning point, in addition to Nehru's being absolutely fascinated with communism and trying to impose those economic ideologies on the Indian economy, which did not do very well, fell flat. But that's kind of your background. And throughout the Cold War, all the years that have followed, the relationship between India and Russia has been very close, very symbiotic. So India does not recognize the sanctions. Before February of 2022, India was getting less than 1% of its energy from Russia. Now it's the largest provider. So imports from Russia have increased by 400% in the 8 months through November. The idea at the time was to potentially engage in trade in rubles or rupees. Neither of those happened. There's no fixed exchange rate. There was really no mechanism. They're actually going through the United Arab Emirates right now in order to facilitate the exchange because the dirham, am I saying it right, dirham, is pegged to the dollar. So that's how this trade has been facilitated. International regulatory authorities have begun to recognize that there may be something problematic going on with UAE being this facilitator. But long story short is India was hoping that there would be a more balanced trade. Instead, Indian exports to Russia have actually declined 14% in that time. And other than military munitions, which that's India's main longstanding tie. Right now, they're coming through their third winter right now with Chinese forces and Indian forces that are amassed on the Himalayan border. So they rely on Russia for their munitions. The World Bank came out at the end of last year, and they said, we anticipate that India is going to be the fastest growing economy in the world in 2023. They came out with some economic data a few nights ago. Things are not working out nearly as well as they had planned, and they have, of all the G7, by far the deepest budget deficit of any country, and it's anticipated that is going to stay very deep this year. Inflation is also very highly problematic. Here's Russia. So a buddy of mine jokingly quipped, double-digit inflation. Look at the size of that budget deficit. Receipts down. He said, you may as well be describing America, or at least in the eyes of other countries. You're not. You're describing the fiscal cost of war in Russia, which has been extremely expensive. They didn't pay out New Year's bonuses. The job market there is very much compromised. They're not getting nearly what they anticipated getting in terms of revenues. On December the 2nd, I want to say, of 2022, they imposed a cap on Russian oil. This has been much, much more severe for the Russian economy than have been the sanctions. And if you look at that orange line, right now the 2023 Russian budget is predicated upon $70 oil. They're getting about half of that. And again, this is the same as any country like Venezuela or many, many countries. They set their budgets based on unrealistic oil prices. Part of the problem here is this narrative about the Chinese reopening and this magnificent amount of demand that's going to emanate from the Chinese economy that really hasn't happened. In addition to what they're getting for per oil, and it's the people who insure oil shipments that are actually enforcing this cap on Russian oil. But in addition to the fact that they're no longer selling to Europe, which is very, very costly for Russia, their transportation costs are through the roof to get the oil to India, to get the oil to China. So that's been an even more detrimental financial effect. And here we have the China reopening trade. So I think Goldman Sachs was it that came out and said that there's going to be additional 1 million barrels of oil per day coming out of China. That really has not manifested. In fact, the People's Bank of China did a survey at the end of last year and found that of the $2.6 trillion in excess savings that had been amassed by Chinese households in 2022 alone, only 20% anticipated spending more money, splashing out. And in fact, 60% said that they were going to save more of their money. And what has the Chinese government done that they did not do in 2008, 2009, that they did not do in 2015, 2016? They have not invested tons of stimulus monies in reinvigorating their industrial sector. And that was the linchpin in those episodes, the great financial crisis, the big industrial global recession, was that China came out spending enough money to lift the entire global economy, especially its trading partners. Think of Brazil, the most reliant Latin American country on China for its exports. It's not doing that this time. It's not building extra apartment buildings. My friend Leland Miller he's drilled it into my head. The Chinese government tried to break their property sector 4 times. They finally succeeded this last time around. They're certainly not going to go back and undo what they have accomplished. So there's not a lot of infrastructure building that's going to be going on. That's why you've seen copper prices fall to a 5-week low after hitting a 7-month high in January. It's because this reopening trade, with deference to Goldman Sachs, really isn't what was anticipated. That's also highly problematic for Russia. So I was mentioning to Kathleen before I came up that the most interesting takeaway from studying this subject is, by way of background, Zoltan Pozsar. I don't know if are any of you familiar with Zoltan Pozsar's work in commodities trading and this big shift away from the dollar. He and I were in Vail a few weeks ago. We were at the Fed at the same exact time during the crisis, and we're very good friends. But I beg to differ with some of his conclusions, and that was just a hunch. As things turned out, the dollar has actually gotten stronger in the last year. And you've seen countries be extremely nimble. Germany built floating LNG terminals. They're putting together ways in which to accept natural gas aside from Russia very, very quickly. And again, the United States is the beneficiary. We're the largest producer of oil by far. That's anticipated to continue rising in coming years. And I think countries that have been burned by Russia cutting them off will have long memories and will try to do what they can to support the oil sector of the United States and, by extension, the dollar, which is very quietly strong right now. And you've seen oil prices fall. So the biggest question coming into this today, and I'll tell you, there's an asterisk. When I was in Vail recently, a gentleman brought up, this was Chatham House, but a gentleman said, Danielle, there's one argument that holds against this. The Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, it protects property rights not just of Americans. It protects property rights of any and all buyers of U.S. property. That's always held until the sanctions. And his observation to me was, now you've got the Fifth Amendment with an asterisk by it, unless you're Russian. If you're Russian, then you don't have property rights in the United States. And his greatest concern, and I certainly sympathize with that, is what if the Chinese get it in their head that there's a double asterisk somewhere in the future, that they're also going to be excluded in terms of being protected by our property rights? And that's a very viable question to ask. And it would be even more troubling if the Chinese economy was on stronger footing than it is, but it's not. Chinese stimulus right now is specifically directed at domestic endeavors, at trying to hold together the social fabric of a society that really has been scarred by the government's COVID policies. The irony is they were placed on a pedestal years ago as having the ideal COVID strategy, but that has not certainly turned out to be the case. And in the end, what we have is, as the slide says, the dollar hegemony is intact. Now, there is a good bit of transactions, global payments that are made in euros, the green bars. But when you look at the dollar as a store of value on that bottom chart, we remain in a very dominant position. Much more pragmatically and much more importantly is that longest blue bar in the middle. And that is the reality of $8 trillion per day in currency transaction volumes. That's not something, the currency market is the deepest and the biggest in the world by far. And every single day we see $8 trillion change hands, and that's done mostly more than 80% in US dollars. So on a practical level, unseating that position with currencies that really don't trade. And I hate to quote Larry Summers, but I think he once said, Europe is there were nursing homes and jails involved describing the euro, the yen, and the Chinese yuan. But to his point, on a practical level, is the debt ceiling debacle going to be problematic going forward for people's perceptions of the US dollar? Absolutely. Have we put the US dollar at risk because of these sanctions going forward, because there's the potential for another asterisk on property rights? Absolutely. But for the moment, the US dollar continues to reign supreme, and that was the findings of everything that I have studied, and Mother Nature gave her fair share of assistance by having a very mild winter, not just here in the United States, but much more importantly in Europe. So they haven't had to pay the steep price, as the prior speaker mentioned, had it been a winter like 2014. Thankfully, we didn't have that. And so here we are. So I will leave my comments there and hand it over to you, David.
Thank you, Danielle. Dave, it's all yours.
Thank you, Danielle. Great charts. I am happy to admit that I am the worst fisherman of this group. Although I have never
I've never hit
No.
but I don't.
Never tried to hit a fish over the head with a rod.
The worms on the hooks, though, that's my problem. But I've never hit
the key to being
I would be
successful,
too afraid to hit a fish on the head with anything, sorry.
you let your partner catch all the fish, and you take the photos with the fish that he or she caught. I read Thucydides as well, and I was a history major as an undergrad, studied a lot of military history. The key to having successful people you pay, mercenaries, is to have the cash on hand and to pay them on the field. Mercenaries don't work if either of those two things don't happen. So Thucydides should have taken the money with him and said to the Thracians, you will pay when you're here. And history could have been very different if Athens had defeated Sparta instead of the other way around. So I digress. I'm going to talk about some of it will be historical, but some of it will bring forward to today. The impacts of financing wars on economies. And, if you look historically, and we're going to look primarily at the United States, government borrowing goes up significantly in wars. Now, most wars are large in scale, certainly Vietnam, Korea, World War II, World War I, Civil War, as opposed to the smaller wars, the shorter lasting wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan. This is not by any means a war or financing of military options that is anywhere close to any of those. Now, could it increase? Absolutely. Listening to General Breedlove earlier, is there a possibility that NATO has troops on the ground? It's possible. Not likely. Hopefully it doesn't happen. But the war could get bigger. Certainly, if we supply more munitions and equipment to Ukraine, we will have to borrow more to do that. Now, if the economy was not running at full steam, we're pretty much at capacity right now. Not in terms of industrial production, but if you look at the overall status of the economy, potential GDP, where can we be relative to our capacity? We're pretty close to being fully utilized right now. Certainly that's true in the labor force, notwithstanding we're missing 5 million people, but we have no idea if and when they will ever come back. Given the labor force we have, we're pretty much at full capacity there. If we weren't, it's easier to expand production because you've got scarce resources. You have resources that are not scarce that can be used. Right now, labor is a very scarce resource. We have more workers. Hard to produce more. It'll be harder to produce more equipment, more weapon systems quickly, again, as the general talked about this morning. This despite the fact that if you look at defense spending as a share of GDP, it's the lowest it's been in the post-World War II period. It's very low. But we're spending on lots of other things. It's all fungible. It doesn't matter in terms of the macro impact, at least in the short run, where the spending is coming from. In the long run, the thought has been that defense spending, if it's on weapon systems, takes away from the growth in aggregate supply, because it's not business investment spending. It's not R&D on the part of corporations to improve productivity. And we talked a bit yesterday about how some military applications have expanded to the civilian sector. GPS is one that didn't come up yesterday, but it's a big one. So that's not entirely accurate. But it is roughly true that if more money goes to the military, less money is going to other parts of the economy. And while that increases economic growth in the short run, it's increasing aggregate demand in the economy. It, to either a lesser or greater extent, starves the growth rate in aggregate supply, so that future growth may be less. Again, applications that are done in the defense area that spill over to the civilian area help negate that argument at least somewhat. The other thing we heard yesterday from Loretta Mester, the Cleveland Fed president, was in answer to a question. Monetary policy and fiscal policy, at least in theory, and certainly as she views it, are separate things. So if we have to borrow more in order to increase the production of munitions for Ukraine, for our NATO partners, for us, we will have to do it by borrowing. Now, is that inflationary? It could be, but it's only inflationary if the monetary authority, the Federal Reserve, makes it so. And in fact, if they don't, they hold the line on money growth, continue quantitative tightening, then what you will get is a rise in interest rates, not coming from an increase in expected inflation. Think about what causes long-term interest rates to move. Well, the price of anything is supply and demand. So supply of credit, demand for credit, plus with longer-term fixed income instruments, because of uncertainty over time, you have what's happening to expected inflation. Where will inflation be in the future? If, in fact, the central bank says, well, we're not going to let inflation grow up because of this, you get an increase in interest rates because the demand for funds is going up. But you're not getting an increase in interest rates because expected inflation goes up. Now, the monetary authority in the short run, if it does want to monetize this increase in federal government borrowing, can hold rates down for a while. But ultimately, if expected inflation goes up because of that growth in monetary aggregates, the Fed, with any monetary authority, cannot hold interest rates down beyond that point. And then rates go up. And they go up for two reasons. They go up a lot in that case. In this case, ceteris paribus, everything else held constant, rates will go up as we borrow more money. But if the Fed holds firm, they may not go up very much. Again, this is a small fiscal impulse relative to past military spending impulses. It could get bigger. It probably will get bigger. But it's still going to be small unless we get involved in a much bigger way than we're likely to. So the increase in interest rates that we're likely to see, again, that doesn't mean rates can't go down for other reasons, but relative to where they would have been without this, the rise in rates may not be that much. Now, still, the budget deficit will go up. We talked a lot yesterday about concerns of the federal budget deficit. It's about to go to levels that we've not seen since World War II. And people are concerned, and this follows on to Danielle's points. Well, how will we finance that? Well, right now, there's no problem with the dollar. Right now, there are no signs that it's been more difficult for the federal government to sell debt. our interest rates are still low. They're higher because the Fed said we're going to hold the line on inflation now, not because we're borrowing a lot. You'd be hard pressed, in fact, to come up with a good econometric relationship that shows that higher budget deficits, in fact, lead to higher interest rates, although we all think they do. And they probably do in the sense that rates are higher than they otherwise would be. But at some point, doesn't it have to be that if we keep borrowing, and again, it doesn't matter where the borrowing comes from, but in the short run, if the borrowing increase is coming from increase in defense expenditures, that other countries in the world who buy US debt start to look at us, and I don't mean to disparage them, but I'm going to say that isn't the US really becoming Argentina? Well, the answer is yes, we could get to that point. But we're probably very far from that. At least we hope so. The thing is, we don't really know. In answer to the question that the general answered this morning about what would Russia's response be to weapons supplied by NATO and principally the US that in fact would allow Ukraine to win on the battlefield. Putin has said, or his mouthpieces in Russia have said, well, don't forget, we have all these nuclear weapons. And the general said, he can't guarantee that they wouldn't be used. No, you can't. We can't guarantee that other countries at some point will view an increase in our budget deficit as a bridge too far and will demand a higher return because of concern about actually being repaid. But there's no sign of that now, just as there's no sign of any significant dollar weakening. Can't promise it won't happen, but we're still probably a long way away. You know, it helps to have the largest economy in the world. It helps to have the currency of the world in our own units. Those things can go away if we don't have good policy. But right now, they're not in danger of going away. So in the short run, at least, we have the ability to borrow more. We won't be happy about it, and there'll be lots of arguing. You know, these bad things can happen, but they're likely to happen in the future. And hopefully at some point we'll reverse federal budget deficits, shrink them, but we'll see. But at least in the short run, we'll see interest rates go up as we borrow more. We won't see interest rates go up if the Fed holds firm and expected inflation goes up. But the dollar will continue to be king dollar, and we are unlikely to see any diminution of foreign demand for federal government debt. And we'll be able to finance this with only a modest rise in interest rates. Again, rates may fall for other reasons, higher than they otherwise would have been. So in the short run, at least, I'm pretty sanguine about the ability to borrow more successfully in order to finance additional defense spending that will help Ukraine and will help defense spending in the US more broadly, particularly in Southeast Asia. So I will stop there.
Well, between the two of you, it's a very widespread view of monetary situation and war. I think perhaps we'll start with some questions from the audience. I see, do we have in the back? Please introduce yourself when you get the mic and let us know if you want one or the other to answer, or both, please.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Again, I appreciate the uniqueness of financial presentations like this on war. I see a lot of different presentations, and rarely do you get people who can speak to the greater detail of finance as opposed to just economics. So I do appreciate that. Thank you. I've read articles that indicate that Russia is somehow avoiding our sanctions, and I've read articles saying that somehow the sanctions are taking effect. Can you comment upon the degree that they're avoiding these sanctions, which has enabled them to continue to produce weapons, or the degree these sanctions are? And I'd really like to know how, if they're avoiding sanctions, how they're doing it, if you have that knowledge. Thank you very much.
I'm going to,
You want to start?
no, I'm going to let you start on this.
I'll start. So what we're finding is, and the general alluded to this morning, is that there are lots of things that are produced in the West that go into Russian weapons systems that we didn't even know were there. Just as we're finding there are lots of things that come from China that go into our weapons system that we didn't know. And as time goes on, those things will change. The sanctions will reduce the micro-components that go into Russian arms. As we'll find out who the firms are, and they will stop producing them for Russian arms. It's easy if you don't know that I'm doing this under the table. Yeah, it's not good, but I make money that way. But once it's brought to the light of day, you will stop. So that will occur over time. And so over time, at least with the components of military weapons, the sanctions will have a bigger and bigger impact.
I would add that Russia's recently reported budget deficit for the month of January, if you look at all the Januaries back to 1998, this was the deepest budget deficit on record for Russia. So we do read a lot about how they are avoiding the sanctions, but I think if you look at the economy of Russia holistically, because they just announced that they're going to be reducing their production of oil by 500,000 barrels. So they're clearly trying to send a signal that their finances are not what they would be otherwise. The war has proven to be highly expensive for them, again, against the backdrop of what they originally envisioned to be their source of financing, which was oil revenues being half of what they need for them to be. So despite skirting the sanctions, they're not in good shape.
I know you've got a question. I just had one, let me follow that right up.
Sure.
Wait, in the microphone.
Is it then proper to conclude that the economic result of that, because the options are the same for them as us, that they will have to, if they don't have the money, they will have to print more money, which will drive inflation up for them? Is that a good economic conclusion?
I think that that's certainly in the realm of possibilities. And again, they're still contending with much higher inflation than we are. Their inflation is much closer to 11% than where we are, which is about half of that right now. So yes, extremely problematic. And again, there's no fixed currency exchange rate when it comes to the ruble. So even if they go down that path, it's still limited. But yes.
And I think that's right. I think we will see inflation in Russia go way up from where it is now. And it's already very high.
Scott Gray, sort of a follow-up to the question here, and then a follow-up to that question, if you allow me, all right? General Breedlove basically said this morning that we are using sanctions against Russia, but they're not working. He specifically said they are working against the people, they're working against the economy, and they're working against the nation state, but they are not working against Putin and his actions, okay? So I guess it's a comment and then a question to that. Is the general correct that yes, we are impacting the economy, we are impacting the nation state, but it really doesn't matter because Putin is who he is sort of the first question. And the second part, I was amazed with India's, the chart you put up on India. It almost seems like India is lessening the blow of the sanctions enough that Russia can continue on.
Yeah, I mean, again, I went into this learning experience, if you will. I was open to any conclusion, and the most surprising of that was India, and how their trade deficit is completely blown out because of this. They're not helping their own economy because they're not exporting anything. In fact, they're exporting less right now, and their inflation is higher than they want for it to be. So no, India by far is because it's not just oil; it's also fertilizer. The munitions that I mentioned, there's a third major import from Russia that India relies on. But yes, you're absolutely correct. This is a nation of 1.4 billion people that don't have natural resources. And they desperately need, especially that fertilizer. So absolutely, India's been a massive mitigating economic force for Russia. That said, as the Russians have discovered the hard way, rather than selling their oil on the global stage into many European countries, relying on two very large buyers puts them in a much worse negotiating position in terms of the price of oil that they have to accept. And again, then the Russians have to get it there. They have to transport it, which is very expensive. So
So I've got two comments on that. One is, how long can the Russians continue to export munitions to India when they need it and they're running out
yep.
in Ukraine? So that may go down significantly as they need it for their own purposes.
And that's India's main fear, is they need those munitions because, again, they're in the third year of a standoff on the Himalayan border.
Second thing is, the general was right. Right now, Putin and his cronies, they're living large. But ultimately, the ability of Russia to wage war depends, one, on how their desire to wage war, and obviously Putin has a significant desire, but their ability to wage war. And if the economy continues to go down, their ability to wage war will go down as well.
Except for pushing.
Well, we're hopefully not getting to the button pushing stage.
Oh, don't do
about
that.
conventional warfare.
The world seems to be in three categories. We have an alliance of the United States, Canada, the Western Alliance, NATO countries, Australia, one group. An alliance which is intensifying, let's call it Russia, Belarus, Iran, North Korea, and other players.
Saudi Arabia.
And the third category, as Danielle, I think, introduced so in a very helpful way, the Admiral's right, was an eye-opener to bring in India because of its size and dimension. So you think about the world in three buckets. Good guys, we're considered the good guys. Bad guys, we are identifying them. And a whole group in the middle. And the middle's trying to figure out a way not to get in either bucket and get the best of both. One of the middle seems to be China. They now do trade settlements with Indonesia in the Chinese currency, not in the dollar. They are expanding very slowly the use of their domestic currency for exchanges. And at the same time, as we'll talk about during the course of this series right through March, they are an expanding, intensifying military presence. Could you comment about currencies, trade in this military competitive context as you see three buckets interfaced in the world?
So I'll very briefly quote Summers twice, which is really bad, but I'll go back to his comment that China is a jail. And I think that the word I would use is idiosyncratic. China is going to have one-off trading relationships in yuan, but I don't see it as being, I don't see it as yet having the potential to be pervasive. Now, they want for there to result from this a bipolar currency type of situation where there are not three groups but two faced off against one another. That benefits China much more, but I don't think we're there yet. In fact, Secretary of State Blinken said that India was one of our most critical partners. And so I think if push came to shove that we would hopefully have the diplomatic sense to be there for India, such that we didn't have a bigger widening gap between the two.
I think that's right. I'll be very brief. That we have not only, hopefully, the political sense, but the economic sense to strengthen ties with India, to draw them out of that group. But the world you're talking about, David, is not much different than the world during the Cold War.
Yes.
The only difference is there's one member of that group, and it's China, that wants to have it become a bipolar world with them as the other side to the U.S.
One more question from the audience?
Actually, it's not a question. It's not that surprising that India decided to be on the sideline. I mean, it's been historically the case that India has been a non-aligned country, and on top of that has, as you mentioned, the issues with China. With regard to the sanctions, I find it extremely interesting because it's true, as the general mentioned, as Scott mentioned, and you also, that at the end of the day, it does hurt the economy. It has the implications about that. However, and this is a German study, it says that at the end of the day, 20% success with regard to sanctions. And when you look at the various countries, whether we're talking Cuba, whether we're talking
Venezuela, yeah.
whether we're talking Iran, the regime change has not happened. It is, again, to satisfy a urge to do something, but the consequences are, I would say, very muddled. How do you look at that? Just your thoughts. Thank you.
You know, it has taken much longer. We hope to have regime change in a number of countries that are authoritarian, whose populations are trampled on, and they truly are, who view the U.S. with disdain. And in many cases, that regime change has not occurred, or at least not yet. And as soon as we come up with a better mechanism to have regime change and to help the people in those countries, we'll probably move that way. But I don't know that we know of a better way.
So, I mean, as a former resident of the city of Caracas, it was such a dramatic, there was such a dramatic need for change back in 1995. I mean, the inequality divide was so just in your face. And I think the tragedy, if you will, of what's happening right now with Russia and China in the alliance is that rather than see more expeditious change for the good of the people and the good of the global economy, we've created this morass where there's this stagnancy. And you end up with non-movement, to think of the squandered natural resources in the country of Venezuela, it's just mind-boggling. And it's all been wasted. The infrastructure's just completely deteriorated. And yet, because of where their alliances stand, there's no movement forward to try and fix anything. And you could make the same parallels, draw some of the same parallels in countries in Africa as well. So, and that's a real shame, while this drags on for longer than I think many had originally envisioned. Well,
Can we thank this panel?
Thank you.
Thanks to all three of you. I'm going to ask Kathleen Stephenson to come up and take the microphone so she can be video here. You take the podium microphone so the video will have you and the two frames. We have a very special treat, a quick announcement for folks about what's happening as we've set this whole series up. So the auditorium is like a TV studio audience. The edited version of these 2 days will be available in about a week, I'm told, or something like that. And then it will be available free and distributed. One of the distributions, it'll be made available to 80,000 members of the Air Force Association of the entire United States, and also the GIC, USF, and any organization. We've tried to make this available everywhere. Let me bring up the Chair Emeritus and Chair of the Central Banking College of the GIC, and my good friend, Kathleen, your session.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Since I am the moderator, I'm going to take just a little detour here, and that's based on the last session's discussion with regard to debt financing, particularly with regard to the war. Just want to give you one historical detail. So for anyone who's losing sleep on the fact that how we're going to finance this war, it's okay. Why is it okay? Because can take a long time to repay the debt. I'm giving you one example, and that is the UK. You might say, well, the UK, look at where they are now. But, just one example. 2015 is when the chancellor at the time repaid the four last undated bonds that were in fact issued back in 1853. And some of them covered the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, and these took place in 1803, in 1853. So we've got time. We can restructure. So based on that, let's move on and welcome to the last session. It's always difficult to be the last session before lunch, but I want to introduce our two speakers. As David mentioned, they are fellows of the College of Central Bankers, which is an integral part of the GIC. And the way we have them, unfortunately, I feel very lonely here at the podium, having our friends, one in Argentina and one in the Czech Republic. The way we have decided to structure this discussion is for the first speaker, and that is Zdeněk Tuma. He is, and I apologize for always stumbling on your first name. He will be speaking first, and he has a little presentation. He is currently the chairman of the supervisory board of the CSOB group, which is one of the largest commercial banks in the Czech Republic. But more importantly for us, he was from 2000 to 2010 the governor of the Czech National Bank. And following him, we will have Alfonso Prat-Gay, who will be talking more in a conversation style, if you will, with us. And he is going to speak to us from Buenos Aires. He was the Minister of the Treasury and Finance under the Macri administration, as David had mentioned earlier, and that was from 2015 to 2016. And he was from 2009 to 2013 a member of Congress, and importantly, from 2002 to 2004, he was the president of the Central Bank of Argentina. We asked both of them to address us today. The reason being that as the title of this session being the central bank during wartime setting, we thought that it would be very interesting for us to listen to two professionals who are not unfamiliar with challenges. And certainly, when you think about where Zdeněk is sitting, he's very close to the regional situation, the challenges of the war in the Ukraine. And Alfonso, he has faced a different type of challenge, perhaps not war, but a challenge of building a central bank almost from scratch, which I think is also quite important in the setting that we have here. So before I shouldn't take longer than this, and I would like to perhaps invite Zdeněk to tell us a little bit about the situation over there, because I know that you have a friend who's very close to the Central Bank of Ukraine. So please go ahead. The podium is yours.
Okay, Kathleen, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to this conference and the opportunity to speak about the situation here in Europe and primarily in Ukraine. Fortunately, I don't have personal experience with the monetary policy during the wartime. Our challenge was primarily the economic transition from the central planning to the market economy. But we are quite close, so that obviously we observe the effort of our colleagues. I have prepared a couple of slides in cooperation with my friend David Vávra, who is advisor to the central bank in Ukraine, and he provided valuable insight into the situation. So I hope that you can see my screen, and
Yeah,
I will.
absolutely.
Okay, great. How to move the slides. Okay. So obviously there is not so many options how to finance the war without any doubt, and I appreciate the organization of this conference. That the war is not only it doesn't have only the military aspect, but also very important the economic one, and it's also the war in the economic area. One option is to finance the war by changing the structure of the public expenditures and to focus more on the military expenditures, or to increase taxes. And obviously, you can use the central bank and to print money with the consequences regarding inflation and other negative consequences for the country. So we can find out, both approaches. Here we refer to Israel and Croatia, but we are of the opinion that the focus on the price and financial stability was not too big, but the situation was handled later on. On the other hand, Cyprus and Colombia tried to find a better trade-off during the conflict, internal or external. And but obviously this is determined very much by the fact that the conflict is on your territory or elsewhere, on the duration of the conflict, on the severity of the conflict. And if the conflict continues too long, it's very difficult to avoid completely the pressure on the central bank. From this point of view, it's the effort in Ukraine is quite successful. I mean that they really try to find a certain trade-off and not to put the pressure on the central bank only on the printing money. We can have some various comparisons with other conflicts, with the history, but it's difficult to compare because, you may remember, some of you, the paper by Thomas Sargent from the 80s when he was looking at the consequences of the First World II, a completely different environment. Nevertheless, some lessons regarding the independence of the central bank, regarding the public expenditures, it still holds. So now let's look at some facts about Ukraine. You can see that surge of inflation, relatively high inflation. On the other hand, with respect to the situation in other countries in the region, is not so bad. For instance, in the Czech Republic, we recorded annual inflation, January to January in the previous year, 17%. It's even higher, for instance, in Hungary, relatively high in Baltic countries. So that not ideal, but it's not bad. And there's you can see the ambition of the central bank of Ukraine to decrease the inflation relatively quickly. Obviously, there will be the factor of a relatively high base in the previous year. So I believe that inflation will be going down, but still it's quite ambitious. What's very important, and I will return to that point later on once again, what's very important is the situation in the banking sector, because you can imagine that in such a conflict there is a real threat that people would withdraw the money from banks and the banking sector could fail completely. It has not happened, and I think that this is really one of successes in Ukraine. But there are some threats ahead of Ukraine authorities. Obviously, without any surprise, there is a very high public deficit. We should take into account this is not only because there are higher expenditures on the military, but also because the economy went down quite substantially, so the denominator is very low. So this is the ratio. So the ratio is very high. But even here, we see that the ambition of the authorities is quite strong, and they would like to stabilize the situation. Regarding deposits, and this is also positive that it's that people. We can see that people keep cash, so that it's there is. The outflow from term deposits, but still they keep money in the bank. So that is, I saw a couple of minutes ago, there is not the pressure on the banking sector yet, and hopefully it will. The authorities and the management of banks will manage to continue this direction. It's not surprising that loans have been going down. This is the chart is about the stock, so that we don't see that sharp decline of loans, but it has been declining. Just let me to explain that that the jump in foreign exchange retail and corporate loans is due to devaluation. So it doesn't mean that suddenly in July there would be many loans. So it's just the effect of depreciation of Ukraine currency. There's a program from the government to support loans, but with the situation in the economy, people and investors typically they wait and they don't invest too much at this moment. So that obviously until there is some kind of better outcome of the conflict, it's personally I would not expect a substantial better situation from this perspective. Here, the banking sector in more detail. Another positive aspect that looking at the left chart, that we can see that most banks are profit making, and that that's perfect. And but with it's not so surprising that some banks are in troubles. There's another aspect that Russian banks have been nationalized and it's controlled by the state. By the way, regarding the banking sector, it will be enormous challenge, after the war, because still 75% of the sector is the state hands, and at least partial privatization will be, from my perspective, will be a must later on. Regarding the cost of risk, I should explain that a sharp decline of NPLs. This is due to the cleaning of the banking sector. So there was the assistance from the side of the state. And obviously, recently in the previous year, the cost of risk was going up. But it's bad, but it's not dramatic. Now, one of the most crucial issues, and I'm going back to the monetary policy and the central bank. This is the financing of the whole economy and of the public sector and so on. So fortunately, there is a substantial financial support from abroad. Otherwise, there would be much more pressure on the public deficits and borrowing from the side of the states and on the central bank. So until now, the central bank tries to to behave relatively independently, but during such a conflict as they have, it's not completely possible. So, as far as I know, there's really discussion ongoing between the government and the central bank how much the central bank should be involved and whether they should print more money. And once again, not only the military support regarding weapons, tanks, and so on is important, but even the financial support. And the situation is better today than 1 year ago, because at the beginning it was difficult to organize everything, but at this moment it seems more or less okay. But the longer the conflict will be, the more difficult it will be to get the support from the general public in other countries. Here you can see the change of the monetary policy framework. Ukraine, the Central Bank for Ukraine, was quite successful. They tried to establish inflation targeting a couple of years ago, the standard monetary policy framework. But when we look at the situation in the wartime, obviously there must be some restrictions. Very rapidly respond to the situation in the market and so on. So the typical position of the central bank as the lender of the last resort has been transformed to market maker of the last resort. In other words, it's up to the central bank to provide the liquidity in the market because otherwise liquidity has disappeared. Also, floating was replaced by the fixed exchange rate, so nominal anchor for expectations as a major anti-inflationary tool, and one can hardly mention that it can be otherwise. And obviously, as a consequence, foreign exchange interventions are used as a monetary policy tool, and also without restrictions on currency transactions, it will not be manageable. On the other hand, it's very positive that people who are abroad and customers of Ukraine banks, they can access their account, and their cards were given abroad. Here, another important aspect. This is the exchange rate. You can see the official and the so-called market rate. What does it mean, the market rate? It means it's, in fact, the cash transactions on the street. But, you probably don't know that, but as I lived, in the central planning before 1990, that gap between the official rate and the shadow market or the black market was very substantial. So that the fact that this is quite close, it's relatively successful, and this is also thanks to the interventions of the central bank. Here, regarding its interest rates, relatively high. So this is still the way how to fight with the inflation. So it's it's the way how to keep the currency in banks. We saw that the lending is relatively low. So obviously the level of interest rates might be also part of the explanation, though probably the economic situation is a major issue for it. Here, from the side of the supervision, I would not. We don't have enough time. I will not to discuss it in detail, but it's clear that also the supervision of the banking sector has to be flexible and not to be so strict regarding the capital and NPLs, and primarily to be very supportive regarding the liquidity to the banking sector. So it's also very important aspect. I will skip this one because the presentation will be available so that you can look at various measures on the side of the central bank. And I will finish with some open questions regarding whether the central bank can return to the inflation targeting relatively soon before the war and after the war immediately, or whether it will require some restrictions for a longer time, whether and in what horizon they should abandon the fixed exchange rate anchor. And one of crucial questions, the willingness of the central bank to finance fiscal deficits. Obviously, it would lead to higher inflation, and in the longer run, it would be very harmful for the economy. In the short run, it might be helpful regarding financing the economy and the public sector. So it's related to the question that whether the central bank and the Ministry of Finance should work more closely together to create a certain committee and to make decisions. So for me, as a former central banker, this is really the crucial question, whether the central bank can maintain the independence during such severe war conflict. And I will stop here. And Kathleen, it's up to you, but I suppose that we will return to questions probably after the kickoff remarks by Alfonso.
Yes, thank you so much. In fact, those questions are very important and right and spot on, I should say, because the discussion that we've had with Alfonso is, touches very much on these issues and from a very different angle. So perhaps, Alfonso, if you want to take those questions, the independence of the central bank in the context that you have seen it back when you became the governor. And I don't know if you want to share with us, maybe, you were scratching your head and you said, oh, who should I talk to? Maybe, this would be a nice introduction.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and thank you to the organizers for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor also to share this panel with Zdenek. And I must say, you look too lonely there in the podium, Kathleen. I feel sorry for you.
Yeah.
So
Why didn't you join us?
Hopefully next time we'll do it in person. But I'm flattered to be part of this panel. I mean, it's such an important conference that you guys are having, and this topic in particular, the one that was so neatly covered by Zdenek, is something that doesn't quite show up too much in the discussions, and I think it's a critical one. I mean, we should be starting to think about what's next after the war is over, and how can we help Ukraine to get back on their feet again. And it's not just money; it's a lot of institutional building or rebuilding that Ukraine will need. And that was exactly what Zdenek was suggesting at his very last slide. When I was governor of the central bank 20 years ago, back in Argentina, we were, of course, in the middle of a fight with the IMF. It's always the case with us, unfortunately. It's still the case today. And so I was trying to gather some, support from the actual IMF board. So I called John Taylor, who at the time was Under Secretary of the Treasury, and John Taylor is famous because of the Taylor rule that most central bankers use in some shape or form. And so I rang John, and I got a hold of him on a plane on his way to Baghdad. Back then, he was in charge of the economic reconstruction of Iraq. And after 5 minutes on the phone, he stopped me over and he said, "Listen, Alfonso, your challenge is a lot more, bigger than what these guys in Iraq will have to go through." So that was his introduction to many of the issues that actually Ukraine, or the Central Bank of Ukraine, is going through. We had we had to build a central bank from scratch, and that's no exaggeration. We came from a 10-year worth of a peg regime, but it was more than a peg regime. It was convertibility. Basically, the central bank was no central bank. They were just changing dollars for pesos, but that was it. It was a currency board for 10 years. So the central bank had lost many of its capabilities. There was no monetary policy. There was no research department. We had to change all the financial regulations and rules basically from scratch. We had to set up a monetary policy framework from nil, and that was quite a bit of a challenge. And some of the issues that Zdeněk mentioned at the end of the conversation are issues that Ukraine will have to look into it. For instance, the NPL problem and how to deal with loan risk, and also in our case sovereign risk, because of course the sovereign was in default back then. I remember a discussion we had with a fund, of course, at that time, and also the World Bank, where they basically wanted to mark to market every single asset on the financial system. And that obviously didn't make any sense, because we knew that government bonds were trading way below par during the default. And also many of the private credit was trading too low because the economy was in recession. Now, this is surely something that Ukraine will have to deal with once things normalize. How to deal with significant NPLs, how to compute your capital adequacy ratios. Do you use mark-to-market? Do you use some sort of accounting? We had this fight with the fund, and we won it, because essentially what we put together was a pretty original accounting framework that would force banks towards conversion in the long run, but avoiding mark-to-market in the short run. Because if we had used the market prices, essentially the whole banking system would have been bankrupt. And the fund complained at the beginning, but then in the end they were very happy with the idea of coming with a gradual approach towards the usual accounting standards. Also, Zdeněk mentioned something about how the Central Bank of Ukraine has become the market maker of last resort. And here another anecdote in that regard, which might be useful for Ukraine in the future. When we took over at the end of 2002, the economic and financial system was so unoperational that not even the easiest or the simplest FX T+0 market was working properly. The counterparty risk that we found in the financial system implied that Bank A was not allowed to trade even a very simple security with Bank B, and therefore the whole operation was completely stuck. Not to mention the fact that there was no yield curve because the sovereign was in default. So the central bank, or we central bank, took on responsibilities that usually a central bank doesn't take. For instance, build a yield curve from scratch using our balance sheet rather than the sovereign balance sheet. And also one very interesting thing that we did from day one. I remember having this conversation at the time with Chairman Greenspan that was very intrigued as to how we managed to do that. Essentially, whenever we saw that two banks were not allowed to trade because of internal counterparty risk, we would step in. We would put the two tails of the trade together, and we would use our clearing mechanism at the central bank to deal with the flows from one bank to the other. As simple as it sounds, that was the beginning of actually putting the financial system back to work. I remember Chairman Greenspan asking me, now that you've done it, have you actually thought about how to unplug this facility? Because you're essentially giving credit away for free. And we thought a lot about it. And eventually, I think it was like 6 or 7 months into the game, we started charging a small interest rate on this service that we were providing to the banks. And sooner rather than later, banks decided not to use it, and therefore the situation was completely normalized. So my incredibly long answer to your question, Kathleen, is that when it comes to setting many of these things from scratch, which Ukraine will have to, and which we should be thinking about helping the authorities going forward, I think we need to be understanding, and we need to be very creative when it comes to the accounting mechanism and the financial mechanisms, and to strike the right buttons in terms of triggering the incentive structure that would help all parties involved to go as quickly as possible back to normal.
But it's an interesting point that you're making. The question is, and you've been on both sides in the sense that you've been in Ministry of Finance as well. Does this mean that, as Zdeněk has put, as a question, should we just forget about the independence of the central bank for a specific period of time during the reconstruction, or do we have to be dogmatic in that particular role?
No, I think we never need to be dogmatic, but my view would be that it makes a lot of sense to drop it during wartime, but you've got to make sure that you get it back as soon as possible once you're shooting for normality, because normality will require an independent central bank, and there are so many credibility issues that they can take a back seat in the middle of the war. Of course, there are some priorities, but in the middle of the reconstruction, I would advise otherwise. And in fact, going back to my experience at the central bank, I was lucky enough back then to have a charter that was that would guarantee the independence of the central bank. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case in Argentina these days. But back then it was, and therefore there was no issue whatsoever I had to deal with back then, either with the finance minister or the actual president of the republic. And I think that was a good thing rather than a bad thing. So my advice would be to, as soon as the war is over, central bank independence should be a priority rather than the opposite.
And the idea of the possibility of a central bank to, and here, Zdeněk, I would like you to comment, of building reserves, particularly gold reserves, would that help in terms of achieving, let's say, the positioning of a central bank to remain independent, or to re-achieve, if you will, the position of being independent at the rebuilding phase?
Well, regarding gold reserves, I think that the independence, it's about the institutional independence. I don't think that it's about the structure of foreign exchange reserves. Personally, I'm not in favor of gold too much. It doesn't bring any return. So it's interesting development regarding gold in reserves of central banks, because there was one period when central banks were removing or were selling gold massively in some countries like China and Russia. They have been hoarding gold once again. So I don't think that the gold is something that would help to preserve the independence of the central bank. It's about the consensus, and it's about the political support and willingness to do that. always it's the something which is set up by the legislation, and in the end, the political power would be always stronger. So it's about the agreement inside among authorities. It's my view. I don't know, Alfonso, how would you see?
No, I think the answer would be contingent on whether the sovereign is in arrears or whether the sovereign is not, because I think the risk that that central banks under a sovereign default may run is that creditors might want to seize their assets, as that has been the case across Latin America over the years. So if that is the case, then the beauty of gold is that you can always keep it at home, and therefore you're not running the risk of your reserves being seized, which, by the way, is something that shocked. Let's look a little bit on the other side of the counter. That was a shocker for the Russian central bank, to think that their reserves were completely safe at Basel or elsewhere, and all of a sudden they can't access to those reserves anymore, for the right reasons, of course. I'm not making a moral point here, but I think the implications of those sanctions, and I saw there was some discussion about this in the previous panel, is something that will shape central bank asset management going forward in the years to come, and something we will have to think about eventually going forward.
I know I'm going to be very, very unfair here, but before we open it up to the questions in the audience, if you can just very briefly tell us how you view the difficulties or not so difficult aspects of imposing the sanctions that we've seen on Russia, in terms of literally the plumbing of that system on an international basis.
Well, it's a very complex question, because it's on the one hand you mentioned the international coordination, but the second aspect is the support from the general public. So that the longer is the conflict, the more difficult would be to maintain the support, and this support varies across countries. So here in the Czech Republic, Poland, it was very strong, and so people supported, and they provided financial support themselves. And regarding sanctions, obviously, it's also damaging for the economies, of those countries who apply the sanctions. So it's a must. I think that it's necessary to weaken economically Russia. And but it's true that it takes some cost on our side as well. But I was mentioning regarding financing, that financial support, which is important, it's the support to Ukraine. But at the same time, it's necessary to make Russia as big as possible.
Yeah. And Alfonso?
Yeah, I mean, just to add my 2 cents here, I mean, there's no question that it's the right thing to do. We should not be naive as to think that it comes without cost. It will have costs, not only for the country you're trying to target, but for the financial system as a whole. I think the whole idea of cross-border flows are now changing significantly. There was some discussion about this in the previous panel, how China is becoming a more important player because of that. When the SWIFT system when Russia was kicked out of the SWIFT system, we've seen a significant activity in the alternative Chinese system, the CIPS system, which is growing and growing. And we're seeing a lot of triangulation of flows throughout China. And I'm not sure this was an intended consequence of the sanctions. So eventually you are nurturing your main competitor, let's put it that way, going forward in a bipolar world. And also when it comes to actual, the day-to-day central banking operations, there are issues around whether you become more and more exposed to the renminbi, whether you should do something about that with your reserves, and as Senek was mentioning before, whether you interact with countries that abide to or not abide to the sanctions. I mean, it's a very unfortunate but necessary situation. My only point is that let's not think for a minute that it's easy to impose them and it's just that, and that you're not paying a cost for that. I think the cost will stay with us for much longer than many people think, because this is not like isolating Iran or Venezuela. Russia was a significant player of the global chessboard, the financial chessboard, right before the war. So the consequences will stay with us for quite some time, I think.
Yeah.
Let me add one example from this region, Kathleen, if I may.
Yes.
For instance, the EU agreed that it would not import oil from Russia. It's a totally fresh decision. But, for countries like the Czech Republic, Slovakia, countries without very limited access to other sources, this is, very difficult decision, and it has a certain impact. But it was necessary to do it.
Right. It's very hard to switch immediately on that. And I know that the audience is getting very, very anxious to ask questions. Unfortunately, you will not be able to see who's asking, but I will ask them. We will recognize the first question. Let's put it this way. Go ahead, David.
Thank you. It's David Kotak, Zdenek. Alfonso, it's so nice to see you. If you were here, I would say embrazo. It's a pleasure and thank you for participating with us. Listening to your wonderful presentations and recalling the GIC visits to Prague and to Buenos Aires, the difficult task Zdenek was trying to manage a central bank and a currency when the euro was in its formative stage, and he had to adjust to an international institution and try to get admission for his country. And you, Alfonso, in your career, had to renegotiate a massive debt structure. I remember when we spoke about it, and our group was with you in Buenos Aires. But in both those cases, the debt GDP ratio of the United States was lower. The euro debt structure, to its ability to finance and pay, the margin was much thinner. In the case of Japan, the Central Bank of Japan holds enough Japanese debt for the entire GDP of the country. That's a different structure that faces Ukraine. How do you see the extended leverage of the G7 countries changing this global environment? Would it be different for you? It's a counterfactual, of course. And how would you advise a friend who was in the College of Central Bankers who had to face that renegotiation today?
All this in 2 minutes. You realize that, right?
Yeah, let me start, and I don't want to take too much time. But my first thought here, David, you're kind of pointing out to it, is that the central banking and monetary policy in the G7 world is becoming more and more like emerging market central banking policy. And I'm not, whether it's a good or a bad thing, basically it's what it is. To some extent, monetary policy has come together as one in the following sense. I mean, the issues that G7 is discussing now are the usual issues that we've discussed forever in our regions and in our countries. The idea of fiscal dominance after QE or QE2, if you will. The idea of the implications of rising rates, not just on the sovereign debt sustainability, but also on the central bank balance sheet. This is something nobody mentions, but you just mentioned Japan and how the JGBs that the Bank of Japan owns. The same is true, or not the same, but similarly in Europe and in the US. Now, central banks are not mark-to-marketing, but if they were mark-to-marketing their portfolio of sovereign bonds, they would be showing significant losses right now, David, to the tune of like $2 trillion worldwide. And I think that that's one of the reasons why after 500 basis points worth of tightening in the US, we haven't as of yet seen any significant financial accident, essentially because the financial accident is being borne by the authorities, and the authorities are not showing it properly, I would argue. No? The other issue that reminds me of emerging market central banking is that along the way, particularly after the global financial crisis, G7 central banks seem to be converging towards this very uncomfortable situation that you have sometimes in the emerging market world, which is central banks shooting for too many goals and using too many instruments. No? When you listen to some of the authorities talking about income distribution, climate change, racial discrimination, and so forth, which is all things we would all long for, but I don't see how that should be part of the toolkit of a central bank, and it's happening more and more in the G7 world. And of course, the discussion about central bank independence is also growing for the G7 world, and the way in which some of the members of the board of directors are being nominated, and whether well, in the US not so long ago, you had a president that was complaining against the level of interest rates with Chairman Powell and so forth. So I think some of these issues are like, you took the genie out of the bottle with the way in which the pandemic was dealt with, and they will stay with us for a while. So I think G7 would do themselves a favor if they looked a little bit about how these issues evolved in the emerging market world. And I'm sure there, Zdeněk and myself are willing to help if help need be.
Let me add a couple of points. David, you are certainly right that the world is perhaps more complex and in some sense a more difficult situation. There is much more debt in developed countries. On the other hand, we have seen in the last 20 years, we have seen a number of positive changes. 20 years ago, the Eurozone was, still at a scratch, and these countries, the Central and Eastern Europe, we became members of the EU. So since then, it can be seen that the Eurozone has developed substantially. There was the financial crisis with enormous impact on the institutional design of the financial landscape. We have new institutions. We have Financial Stability Forum. We have European system Euro System Risk Board. We have the single supervisor in the Eurozone. So on the one hand, there are new challenges or bigger challenges than before. On the other hand, the financial system is certainly more robust. So we have some lessons, we have some tools. Certainly, the Ukraine after the war, it will be a challenge for everybody. for us to help them with the reconstruction. We have the institutions like the EBRD, and in fact, in my opinion, EBRD was looking for what to do in previous years. So it's exactly what the institutions like EBRD and also supported by EIB should do. So I'm relatively optimistic. You are right, big challenges in the new environment, but we have gone through quite difficult times in the previous 20, 25 years as well. And by the way, let's not forget what has happened in this region, what happened in this region 30 years ago in 1990, quite recently, we celebrated 30 years of separation of Czechoslovakia, and in 1990, we also started from the scratch with everything. In fact, it was a central panic. We didn't have institutions, the legislation, and let's look where we are today.
Very good. Any other questions? I just want to mention one thing, Alfonso, that you mentioned, that it seems as though monetary policy in the G7 is essentially throwing everything in the kitchen sink in a way. But, when you look at what has happened, right, we've got the crises, we've got the climate issues, we've got war somewhere. You almost, number one, need to see that the role of the central bank has enlarged. The problem is that, we don't have a very set of rules, if you will, or a model like the Taylor rule we had that was fairly simple back then. It's a much more complex environment. And I'm linking that really to the effort of central banks to achieve financial stability. And in order for that to happen, you almost need to take into account so many different factors. And this leads me to another, perhaps, what might be an heretic or heresy in the thinking, namely that the role of government has really increased dramatically. And whether that is an accident, whether it is a temporary situation, or whether it is a new path for some countries, one needs to really take that seriously. And the role, particularly in these crises, that's not to be minimized.
Yeah, absolutely. I think coordination should be the name of the game, and I think we should be very clear about what we need the central bank to be independent on, and thereafter give the central bank all the tools they need to deliver on that capacity where the political system decided to give them independence. Because let's remember that they're not elected officials, and therefore there's a reason for that. But also the system that we're all talking about is a democracy. Right now, for instance, Kathleen, there's a discussion, next door, very close to home in Brazil, about central bank independence, and I think it would be very interesting to be looking at that, because when Lula was president in his first term, he was very tidy, and he was very respectful of central bank independence. And right now, he's making some different noises, and it's a shame in general, but also in particular, because I believe the Central Bank of Brazil was probably the most disciplined central bank around this very last episode of pandemic plus war in Ukraine. And they're dealing with the inflation bout extremely well. In fact, for a while until very recently, Brazil's inflation was actually, Brazil's and Mexico, I would argue, were below the US inflation. So there's an obvious value in having a central bank being independent. My concern is that if you start asking more things for the central bank to deliver on, you run the risk of giving up on the one thing they do need to be independent. So I much rather use the word coordination during crisis and settling times, but keep the sacred independence for a different chapter, I would argue.
That's very well said. We were supposed to have a duet singing here, but we don't have the drummers. And my voice, I lost it.
Well, it is a pleasure to see both of you. Ladies and gentlemen, 3 capital cities are involved in this conversation. The edited version of this will be distributed or made available to hundreds of thousands of people. The 3 capital cities are Prague, Buenos Aires, and Sarasota. Thank you both. It's nice to see you. We're sorry you're not with us in person, but we'll do that the next time. And we wish you safe travels, safe journey. There's a lot of work for us to do. The College of Central Bankers of the Global Interdependence Center brings together people that you've just seen from around the world. It is a unique grouping of wisdom. And we've had the delight of both of you sharing wisdom with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes. The next session is all virtual. That's on March 9th. And then the next in-person hybrid sessions like this are March 23rd, 24th, and April 20 and 21. And it will feature content as you've seen in the last 2 days. Everyone is welcome. So without further ado, Scott, one final word from Scott, and then we'll go to lunch.
I just want to try and wrap up here. What we've tried to put together, and this with David and the doctor and myself, was a look at how a regional war, if you will, is impacting the world economically and fiscal policy throughout there. So as David said, yesterday we had Dr. Messer talk, and look at how her talk has had implications already on the markets. I mean, pretty amazing. Then we got into discussion of investment implications, all right? We follow that up with another discussion on defense budgets and its implications. I meant to say yesterday, and I did not. When I was working for the Secretary of Air Force for acquisition, we would go to Congress trying to buy a new tanker. And what we'd tell them, and this is in 2009, and it has not changed, okay, was the female has not given birth to the female that will fly the last KC-135 to the boneyard, all right? Yesterday, the Air Force grounded its entire fleet of KC-135 tankers because of a maintenance problem. They were delivered in the 50s and 60s, my friends, all right? Budget implications are real. War impacts on budgets and fiscal policy are real. Today, we kicked off with General Breedlove, and he said a couple of things that really hit home with me, all right? And I'm going to recap some of this because I think it's important that we understand. The U.S. misread Russia's intentions, and he said, I was wrong. A 4-star general, former SAC said, I was wrong. He personally misread the intentions, all right? Number 2, he said that Russia misjudged the Ukrainian capabilities, all right? He mentioned how they showed up with their dress uniforms versus ready to go to war. And he said that Zelensky said, all your eyes were focused on Russia. You were not focused on the Ukraine. Those are pretty potent and powerful statements, right? He then went on and talked about 14,800 kids that have been deported. And at the very end, he talked about how it's a war crime and we all need to get involved and disseminate that information with every vehicle, every platform we can to include our elected officials. And I urge you to follow up on that. That is a crime. That's a crime against humanity, and we need to follow up on that. The last question that we really talked about was how does this war end? He said there's 3 paths. Number 1, we give the Ukrainians the tools they need to win. All right. Number 2, we maintain sort of the status quo. All right. And that will be a war of attrition, if you would. And number 3 is if we stop supplying, Russia wins. All right. So there's really only one outcome in there that's worth discussing, and that is that we must give the Ukrainians what they need to win. Second presentation today was about the role of the financial system in war. And I was stunned when Danielle showed a slide about India, who remained neutral, if you will. Neutral in words, but not in actions. Okay, so actions matter, words matter. What they have done is they have bought all the oil that Russia wasn't selling other places. Okay, so those really made an impact. And David was talking very much about the impacts of economy in many ways, economics in many ways on this, about increasing production by using bonds. When's the last time anybody bought a savings bond? When I went in the military back in the 70s, that was mandatory. I mean, you literally walked in, every month was a savings bond drive. We don't do that. The last declared war in the United States was World War II. America has been at the mall while its military has been at war, all right? The reason you sell bonds is because you mobilize your nation. You make the nation hurt. You make the nation understand that this is a wartime effort. Are we going to do that again to help pay down some of this debt? Don't know, but you brought up a very interesting point there, David. And then the role of the central banks. What a great concluding discussion for our two-day session here. The task they have is absolutely insurmountable. And I took away from it, and I would like to get a copy, and when it's put out, I will. But Zegniks, I hope I didn't pronounce it too incorrectly. Okay, he had two slides that really sort of drove it home. His first was, how do you maintain price stability in peacetime versus war? And one was green, one was red. It was really pretty hard hitting when you took a look at it. And then his open questions, my gosh. You know, just a phenomenal way to end up our two-day session on war, a regional war with worldwide economic and fiscal policies. On the 9th, and David alluded to, our next meeting is 9 March. We're going to start off with Lieutenant General David Deptula from the Mitchell Institute of AFA talking about drones and emerging technologies. He is an expert. He's on Fox News all the time, and it will be a great way to start off that day. We're then going to move into a discussion on artificial intelligence in war, and that's going to be transformational. And the speakers we've got coming in are coming in from the Joint Special Operations University, Army Cyber Institute, and we've got Brian Barner from the head of analytics at the Value Bridge Advisors. This one will be absolutely captivating because it's going to show you what the future of warfare will most likely look at. So I urge all of you to see Jill, get signed up here in person. For those of you out there in Zoom land, continue to hit the website, and we look forward to seeing everybody on the 9th. I have to give a shout out to Cole and to Kelly over here and to our cameramen for making this possible. We could have done it without you. So thank you, folks, for what you're doing. And we will see everybody, even if it's virtually, on the 9th of March. Thank you very much.